In a quiet town built on faith, a man named Jeffrey Lundgren didn't just preach belief. He rewrote reality itself, drawing a devoted inner circle into a world where doubt became weakness, obedience became truth, and one family's quiet resistance would slowly turn into one of the most chilling and least understood tragedies in American history. This is the story of the Kirtland Massacre, where nothing felt wrong, until it was already too late. Chapter 1. The Quiet Arrival of a Believer. There are some stories that begin loudly, with chaos or headlines or a moment that immediately demands attention. But others begin in silence, in ordinary places, with ordinary people. And in the early 1980s, in a quiet corner of Kirtland, Ohio, this story began not with violence, but with belief. Kirtland was not the kind of place where anything unusual was expected to happen. It carried a quiet historical weight, known in religious circles as an important early site for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Visitors came and went, drawn by history, by faith, by a sense of connection to something older and larger than themselves. The town itself moved at an unhurried pace, its streets lined with modest homes and trees that seemed to soften every sound. Into this setting arrived a man named Jeffrey Lundgren. At first glance, there was nothing about him that would have drawn concern. He spoke calmly, often with a tone that suggested deep thought and careful consideration. He had a presence that felt grounded, almost reassuring, especially to those searching for direction. People who met him often described him as someone who seemed to carry answers, or at least the promise of them. And in a time when many were searching for meaning, for certainty, for structure, that promise could be powerful. Lundgren had not always been a religious figure. His earlier life had taken different turns, including time in the military and various jobs that never seemed to fully define him. But over time, his interest in religious teachings grew stronger, more focused. He became deeply invested in Scripture, particularly in interpretations that went beyond surface understanding. He wasn't content with simply following teachings. He wanted to decode them, and that desire to interpret, to uncover hidden meanings, became the foundation of everything that followed. When he became associated with the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he found a space where his ideas could begin to take shape. At first, he was simply a member. Then, gradually, he became more involved, more vocal, more influential. He began teaching classes, not formal sermons, not official doctrine, but smaller gatherings. Discussions, interpretations. He would take passages of Scripture and present them in ways that felt deeper, more intense, as if there were layers others had missed, and people listened, because what he offered wasn't just knowledge. It was certainty in a world that often felt uncertain. That was something many found difficult to resist. There's a particular kind of influence that doesn't rely on force. It grows slowly, almost invisibly. It builds through trust, through repetition, through the quiet reinforcement of belief. And Lundgren understood this instinctively. He didn't demand loyalty at first, he earned it. Those who attended his sessions often found themselves drawn in by the clarity with which he spoke. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess. His interpretations came across as confident, even authoritative. And over time, that confidence began to blur the line between interpretation and truth. For some, he became more than just a teacher, he became a guide. And for a smaller group, something even more as his following grew, so did the intensity of his teachings. He began emphasizing ideas that suggested the presence of hidden truths within Scripture, messages that required not just reading, but understanding at a higher level. He spoke about divine order, about the importance of obedience, about the dangers of straying from what he believed to be the correct path. There was an underlying theme to everything he said, that he saw something others did not. And slowly, that idea began to take hold. It's important to understand how subtle this transformation was. There was no single moment where everything changed. No clear dividing line between ordinary religious discussion and something more controlling. Instead, it was a gradual shift, a change in tone, a deepening of language, a quiet increase in expectation. Those who followed him began to rely on his interpretations, not just as guidance, but as truth. And once that reliance was established, it became increasingly difficult to question, because questioning, in that environment, began to feel like doubt, and doubt was something Lundgren spoke about often, not as a natural part of belief, but as a weakness as something to be overcome. And so, within this quiet town, within these small gatherings, a structure began to form. Not an official organization, not something recognized or visible from the outside, but something just as powerful, a circle, a group of individuals who shared not only belief, but trust in a single voice. And as that circle grew stronger, it also became more isolated. Not physically, at first, but mentally. The more they listened to Lundgren, the more his interpretations shaped how they saw everything else. Other perspectives began to feel less valid, less complete, eventually unnecessary. This is how influence deepens, not through force, but through alignment. And by the mid-1980s, that alignment was becoming something more defined, more structured, more dependent. Lundgren was no longer just a teacher, he was becoming a central figure at a point of authority. And while the outside world continued as it always had, quiet streets, ordinary routines, the steady rhythm of daily life, something beneath the surface was changing, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. There is a certain stillness that often exists before something significant unfolds. Not a dramatic silence, but a subtle one. A sense that everything appears normal, even as underlying tensions begin to take shape. In Kirtland, that stillness remained. No alarms were raised, no warnings were issued. Because from the outside, there was nothing to see. Just a man, a group of followers, and a belief system that, at first glance, seemed no different from countless others. But within that belief system, something was beginning to shift. Something that would, in time, move far beyond interpretation, far beyond guidance, into something far more controlled and far more dangerous. And as the circle tightened, as trust deepened, and as one voice became more central than all others, the foundation for everything that followed was quietly being set, not with noise, not with urgency, but with patience and belief. As the weeks turned into months, something subtle yet powerful continued to take shape within the small gatherings that formed around Jeffrey Lundgren. What had once been casual discussions began to feel more structured, more intentional, as if each meeting carried a purpose that extended beyond simple interpretation. The atmosphere itself began to change. First, people came with curiosity. They listened, they asked questions, they compared what they heard with what they already knew. But gradually, the tone shifted. Questions became less frequent. Not because curiosity disappeared, but because answers were already being provided with such certainty that questioning them began to feel unnecessary, or even inappropriate. Lundgren's way of speaking played a significant role in this transformation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rely on dramatic gestures or emotional appeals. Instead, he spoke with a calm, steady rhythm, as though every word had been carefully considered long before it was spoken. There was a quiet authority in that tone, one that didn't demand attention, but seemed to naturally hold it. And in that calmness, people found reassurance. But reassurance can sometimes become dependence. He began introducing ideas that required a deeper level of commitment, not outwardly at first, but in subtle ways. He spoke about dedication, not just to belief, but to understanding. He emphasized that true comprehension required effort, discipline, and, most importantly, trust in the process. And in this context, he became that process. Those who followed him closely started to organize their lives around these teachings. Meetings became more frequent. Conversations extended beyond scheduled gatherings, spilling into daily interactions. The ideas discussed were no longer confined to a single place or time. They became part of how people thought, how they interpreted events, how they understood themselves. That IT wasn't sudden, it was gradual, but it was effective. There is a particular dynamic that forms when a group begins to share not just beliefs, but a unified perspective shaped by a single source. It creates a sense of cohesion, a feeling of being part of something meaningful, something distinct from the outside world. And with that distinction comes a subtle separation. Without ever explicitly stating it, Lundgren began to draw a line between those who understood and those who did not. It wasn't framed as exclusion, it was framed as clarity. He spoke about the importance of remaining aligned with truth and how external influences, other interpretations, other teachings, could create confusion. Over time, this idea encouraged those around him to rely less on outside perspectives and more on what was being shared within the group. And so, the circle became more inward-facing, not physically isolated yet, but intellectually and emotionally more contained. There was also a shift in responsibility. Lundgren began assigning roles, though not always formally. Some individuals became more involved in organizing gatherings. Others took on responsibilities that supported the structure of the group. These roles created a sense of purpose, reinforcing the idea that each person was contributing to something important. And with purpose came deeper commitment. Among those who followed him, there were individuals who found in this structure something they had been searching for: a clear sense of direction, a feeling of belonging, a belief that they were part of something meaningful and guided. But as that commitment deepened, so did the expectations. Lundgren began to emphasize obedience, not in a harsh or overt way, but as a natural extension of trust. If one truly believed in the teachings, he suggested, then following them fully was not a burden, but a responsibility, a sign of faith. And slowly, the idea of independent interpretation began to fade, because if the truth was already being revealed, what need was there to question it? This is how influence evolves into control, not through force, but through alignment so complete that alternative perspectives begin to feel unnecessary. Within this environment, even small disagreements could take on greater significance, not because they were openly confronted, but because they disrupted the sense of unity that had been carefully built. And over time, unity itself became something to protect, something to preserve. Lundgren's teachings also began to include more specific ideas about order, about structure, hierarchy, and the importance of each person knowing their place within a larger framework. These ideas were presented as logical extensions of belief, as natural patterns that existed within both Scripture and the world, but they also served another purpose. They reinforced his position, because within that framework, he was not just a teacher, he was a leader, a central point of understanding, someone whose role was not only to interpret, but to guide. And as that role became more defined, so did the expectations placed on those around him. Commitment was no longer just about attending gatherings or listening to teachings. It became something deeper, something that touched every aspect of life. Decisions, relationships, priorities, all began to align more closely with the structure that was forming. This kind of alignment can feel empowering, but it can also limit perspective because when one voice becomes the primary source of truth, other voices begin to fade. And over time, that silence can become significant. There were moments, small, almost unnoticeable, where the direction of this group could have shifted. Moments where questions might have been asked, where perspectives might have been reconsidered. But those moments passed quietly, often without recognition, because everything, on the surface, still appeared calm, still appeared structured, still appeared purposeful. And that sense of purpose was one of the most powerful elements holding everything together for those within the group. There was a growing belief that they were part of something important, something that required dedication, focus, and trust. And in that belief, many found meaning. But meaning, when guided too narrowly, can also become restrictive. And as the structure around Lundgren continued to solidify, as roles became clearer and expectations more defined, the balance between guidance and control began to shift further, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. The outside world remained largely unaware of these changes. From a distance, there was nothing that suggested anything unusual. There were no visible signs of conflict, no outward disruptions, no indications that anything beyond ordinary religious activity was taking place. But within the circle, the dynamics were evolving. Trust was deepening, dependence was increasing, and authority was becoming more centralized. All of this unfolding quietly. Within a town that remained as peaceful and unassuming as ever, it's often said that significant events rarely begin with obvious signs. That the most impactful changes are the ones that happen gradually, beneath the surface, where they are least likely to be noticed. And in Kirtland, that gradual change was well underway. The foundation had been laid. The structure was forming. And within that structure, one voice was becoming increasingly difficult to separate from the truth itself, that a transformation that, at first, seemed almost invisible, but would, in time, lead far beyond what anyone within that quiet circle might have imagined. Chapter 2. A mind drawn to absolute truth. Long before the quiet gatherings in Kirtland, Ohio began to take shape. Long before influence slowly turned into authority, there was a different version of Jeffrey Lundgren. A man still searching, still forming, still trying to understand where he fit within a world that often felt uncertain. To understand what unfolded later, it becomes important to step back, not to excuse, not to simplify, but to observe the path as it developed, piece by piece. Because paths like these are rarely sudden. They are built over time. Lundgren's early years did not immediately suggest the direction his life would take. Like many others, he moved through phases: education, work, service, each step appearing ordinary on its own. He spent time in the military, an environment that introduced structure, discipline, and hierarchy. For some, that structure becomes a temporary phase. For others, it leaves a lasting impression. In Lundgren's case, it seemed to resonate. There is something about clear systems, about defined roles, about order, that can feel deeply reassuring, especially to someone searching for certainty. The idea that everything has a place, that every action has meaning within a larger framework, it can be compelling. And over time, that need for structure began to extend beyond the external world into belief. His interest in religion was not casual. It was focused, deliberate, and increasingly intense. He didn't approach scripture as something to be read and reflected upon in a general sense. Instead, he approached it as something to be analyzed, decoded, understood at a level that went beyond the surface. He looked for patterns, connections, hidden meanings, and as he studied, he began to form interpretations that differed from standard teachings. not necessarily in obvious ways at first, but in subtle shifts. Emphases placed differently, conclusions drawn with a stronger sense of certainty. For many people, encountering differing interpretations leads to discussion, to comparison, to a recognition that belief can take multiple forms. But for Lundgren, the process seemed to move in a different direction, towards certainty. There is a particular mindset that seeks not just understanding, but absolute understanding. Not possibilities, but conclusions. Not interpretations, but answers. And once that mindset takes hold, ambiguity becomes uncomfortable. Questions begin to feel like problems that need resolution. Doubt becomes something to eliminate. Over time, Lundgren's approach to belief appeared to shift from exploration to conviction that he wasn't just studying anymore. He was arriving at conclusions. And more importantly, he believed those conclusions were correct. This distinction is subtle, but significant, because when someone believes they have found the truth, not just a perspective, but the truth, it changes how they interact with others. It changes how they communicate. It changes how they respond to disagreement. It also changes how they see their role. Lundgren's involvement with the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints provided a framework within which his ideas could develop. It gave him access to scripture, to community, to a structure that he could both learn from and, eventually, influenced. First, his role remained within expected boundaries. But internally, something was shifting. That he began to feel that the interpretations he was forming were not just personal insights, but revelations that others had missed. That there was a deeper layer of meaning within the teachings, one that required a different kind of understanding to uncover. And with that belief came a quiet sense of responsibility. If he understood something others did not, was it not his role to share it? This is where intention becomes complex, because from one perspective, sharing insight can be seen as guidance, as helping others understand something more deeply. But from another perspective, especially when certainty is involved, it can begin to take on a different tone, less about sharing, more about leading. Lundgren's communication style reflected this shift. He spoke with clarity, with confidence, with a steady sense of direction. He did not present his ideas as possibilities to be considered, but as truths to be understood. And for those listening, that certainty carried weight, because certainty can be comforting. It removes the burden of doubt. It provides direction. It creates a sense of stability in a world that often feels unpredictable. But it can also limit perspective. Because when one conclusion is presented as absolute, alternative viewpoints begin to lose their place. And over time, that narrowing of perspective can become significant. There were also elements of Lundgren's thinking that reflected a growing focus on hierarchy and order. He spoke about structure, not just within religious teachings, but within life itself, about roles, responsibilities, and the importance of alignment. These ideas, again, were not unusual on their own, but within the context of his developing belief system, they began to take on greater significance, because within a structured system, there are positions, and within positions, there is authority. It's not that Lundgren immediately placed himself at the center of that structure. But as his confidence grew, as his interpretations became more defined, it became increasingly natural, at least from his perspective, for him to occupy a guiding role, not imposed, but assumed. And once that role began to take shape, it influenced everything that followed. His interactions with others became more directed, less about mutual exploration, more about conveying understanding. He listened, but often with the intention of guiding the conversation back toward his own conclusions, and slowly, without any formal declaration, a dynamic began to form. Teacher and follower, guide and listener, interpreter and believer. This dynamic did not appear overnight. It developed gradually, shaped by repeated interactions, by the consistency of his messaging, by the quiet reinforcement of his authority. And within that dynamic, something else began to emerge: trust. Not just general trust, but a specific kind. The kind that places confidence in someone's understanding over one's own. The kind that accepts guidance without needing constant verification. This kind of trust can be powerful. It can create strong bonds. It can bring people together. But it can also create imbalance. Because when trust is concentrated in one individual, the influence of that individual becomes significant. And if that influence continues to grow, it can shape not just beliefs, but decisions. Priorities. Actions. By the time Lundgren arrived in Kirtland, much of this internal development had already taken place. The mindset, the approach, the certainty, it was all there, ready to find a setting in which it could expand. And Kirtland, with its quiet atmosphere and its historical connection to faith, provided that setting. A place where belief was already valued, where interpretation held meaning, where a new voice could find listeners who, like many others, were searching for clarity, for purpose, for something that felt certain. And in that search, they would encounter a man who believed he had already found what they were looking for. A man whose mind had moved beyond questions into answers. Answers that would, over time, begin to shape not just understanding, but reality itself. By the time Jeffrey Lundgren had fully settled into his role within the community connected to Kirtland, Ohio, the transformation that had been quietly unfolding within him was no longer internal alone. It had begun to extend outward, shaping not only how he understood belief, but how others would come to understand it through him. There is a moment, often difficult to identify in real time, when confidence becomes something more. When belief transitions from personal conviction into something that seeks reinforcement through others. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of a growing certainty that what one holds to be true must be shared, must be followed. For Lundgren, that moment did not arrive with clarity or announcement. It emerged gradually. His teachings, which once carried a tone of interpretation, began to take on a sharper edge. The language became more definitive. Where there had once been room for reflection, there was now a stronger sense of direction. Concepts were no longer explored. They were explained, and explanations, when delivered with certainty, can become difficult to question. Those who listened closely began to notice that Lundgren's interpretations were not just deeper, they were also more exclusive. He spoke in ways that suggested that understanding was not evenly distributed, that there were levels to comprehension, and that only a few were willing or capable of reaching the highest ones. This idea carried weight because it did something subtle yet powerful. It separated, not in a visible or confrontational way, but in perception. It created a distinction between those who understood and those who did not. And for those who believed they were part of the former, it reinforced their commitment, because being part of something rare, something elevated, can feel meaningful. It can feel purposeful. And purpose, when combined with certainty, can become deeply binding. Lundgren began to emphasize the idea of chosen understanding, that certain truths were not meant for everyone, but only for those prepared to receive them. This framing added a layer of significance to his teachings. It transformed them from general insights into something more exclusive, something that required not just attention, but dedication. And dedication began to take on a new meaning. It was no longer just about belief. It was about alignment. Those within his growing circle found themselves adjusting, not just their thinking, but their priorities. Time spent with the group increased. External influences, Other teachings, other perspectives, became less relevant, sometimes even discouraged in subtle ways, not through strict rules, but through suggestion, through implication, through the quiet reinforcement that clarity came from within, not from outside. This kind of environment can feel secured. IT reduces uncertainty to IT creates a shared language, a shared perspective. But it also narrows the frame through which the world is seen. And within that narrowing, Lundgren's influence became more concentrated. He began to introduce ideas about obedience, not as submission, but as a natural outcome of trust. If one truly believed in the truth being presented, then following it fully was not a question, but a responsibility, not a sign of commitment. This framing made obedience feel less like an external demand and more like an internal choice. And that distinction mattered, because it allowed individuals to feel that their actions were self-directed, even as they aligned more closely with Lundgren's guidance. There were also shifts in how he addressed doubt. Earlier, doubt had been acknowledged as part of the process of understanding. But now, it was increasingly portrayed as something to be overcome, something that indicated a lack of alignment or incomplete comprehension, not condemned outright, but quietly discouraged, and over time, this discouraged questioning, because to question was to risk being seen as uncertain. And in a system that valued certainty, uncertainty could feel uncomfortable. This dynamic further strengthened Lundgren's position. As fewer questions were asked, his interpretation stood with less resistance. As his voice became more central, alternative perspectives became less present. And slowly, a hierarchy began to solidify, not formally defined, but clearly felt. The center was Lundgren. Around him, those most aligned with his teachings, and beyond that, a broader group that looked to the inner circle for guidance. This structure created stability, but also dependency. Because as individuals became more integrated into this system, their sense of direction became increasingly tied to it. Decisions, beliefs, even relationships began to align with the expectations that were forming. And those expectations, while not always explicitly stated, were understood. There is a certain power in unspoken rules. They do not need to be enforced loudly. They are followed because they are felt. And within this environment, alignment became not just encouraged, but expected. Lundgren also began to speak more frequently about order, about the idea that everything, when properly understood, follows a specific structure. That disorder was not random, but a result of deviation from that structure. This concept extended beyond theology. It touched behavior, choices, actions, and in doing so, it created a framework through which everything could be evaluated, right or misaligned, aligned or out of place. This kind of framework can feel clear, but it can also be limiting because it reduces complexity into categories. And within those categories, judgment can begin to form. At this stage, the transformation of Lundgren's role was becoming more visible, at least within the group. He was no longer just someone who offered insight. He was someone whose insight defined direction, someone whose understanding shaped decisions, someone whose authority, though never formally declared, was increasingly accepted. And with that acceptance came influence, significant influence, the kind that reaches beyond conversation into action. Outside of this circle, life in Kirtland remained unchanged. The town continued its quiet rhythm. Visitors came and went. Daily routines carried on without interruption. There was no outward indication that anything unusual was developing, because from the outside, there was nothing to see. Just a man and a group of people who gathered to discuss belief. But within that group, something had shifted. The balance between guidance and control had moved further. Trust had deepened. Dependence had grown. and one voice had become increasingly central to how reality itself was interpreted. This is how transformation occurs, not through sudden change, but through gradual alignment, through repeated reinforcement, through the quiet strengthening of belief until it becomes structure. And by the time this structure fully took hold, it was no longer just about understanding. It was about following, about maintaining alignment, about preserving a system that, to those within it, felt not only true, but necessary. And as that sense of necessity deepened, so too did the potential for that system to move beyond belief into something far more consequential. Chapter 3: The Formation of a Hidden Circle. By the time the teachings of Jeffrey Lundgren had taken root within his growing group in Kirtland, Ohio, something more defined began to emerge, something that went beyond shared belief and into shared identity. First, it was almost unnoticeable that a subtle shift in how people referred to one another. A quiet recognition between those who attended the gatherings regularly. A sense, unspoken yet clearly felt, that they were part of something distinct, not separate in a visible way, but separate in understanding. This is how circles begin to form, not through official declarations, but through quiet alignment. Through the realization that certain individuals share not just similar beliefs, but a common lens through which they view the world. And within that lens, everything begins to take on new meaning. For those who found themselves drawn closer to Lundgren's teachings, this shared perspective became increasingly important. It created a sense of belonging that extended beyond ordinary community. It wasn't just about attending discussions, it was about being part of something that felt deeper, more purposeful, more refined. Lundgren, whether consciously or not, reinforced this distinction. He spoke in ways that suggested that understanding came in layers, that not everyone was ready to perceive truth in its fullest form, and that those who were willing to commit, to truly engage, would find themselves moving closer to that deeper understanding. This idea naturally created levels within the group, not formally defined, but clearly felt. There were those who listened occasionally, those who attended regularly, and those who became fully immersed. It was this last group that began to form what could only be described as a core, a hidden circle within the larger gathering. This circle did not have a name. It did not have written rules, but it had structure, and that structure was built on proximity. Proximity to Lundgren's teachings, to his interpretations, to his presence. Those within this inner circle spent more time together. Their interactions extended beyond scheduled meetings. Conversations continued late into the evening, often revolving around the ideas that had been introduced, exploring them further, reinforcing them through repetition, and repetition, over time, strengthens belief that it transforms ideas into understanding, understanding into certainty. Within this circle, Lundgren's influence was not just present, it was central. His words were discussed, reflected upon, and increasingly accepted as guiding principles. The more time individuals spent within this environment, the more those principles shaped their thinking. And as that shaping continued, something else began to happen. Their sense of identity began to shift. They were no longer just individuals exploring belief. They were part of a group that shared a specific understanding, one that felt distinct from the outside world. This distinction was not aggressive. It was quiet, but it was meaningful, because once a group begins to see itself as distinct, it also begins to see others as different, not necessarily wrong, but not aligned. And over time, that perception can create distance, not physical distance, but psychological distance. A separation that makes outside perspectives feel less relevant, less necessary. Within this inner circle, Lundgren's teachings also began to take on a more personal dimension. He did not simply speak about general concepts. He began to relate them to individual lives, to choices, to actions, to the way each person should align themselves with what he presented as truth. This personalization deepened the connection between the teachings and the individuals, because it made belief not just theoretical, but practical, something that influenced daily life, decisions, behavior. And as that influence grew, so did the sense of responsibility among those within the circle. They began to see themselves not just as participants, but as custodians of understanding, as individuals who had access to something important, something that required commitment and protection. This sense of responsibility further strengthened the group's cohesion, because it created a shared purpose, a reason to remain aligned, a motivation to maintain unity. Unity, within this context, became more than just harmony. It became essential, because within a system built on shared understanding, differences can feel disruptive, even when they are small, even when they are natural, and so, over time, the environment within the circle became one where alignment was quietly expected, not enforced through confrontation, but encouraged through subtle cues, through agreement, through reinforcement, through the absence of dissent. This absence of dissent is often misunderstood. It does not always mean that questions do not exist. It can simply mean that they are not expressed. Because within a group that values certainty, expressing uncertainty can feel out of place, and so many thoughts remain internal, unspoken, gradually fading as the dominant perspective becomes more established. Lundgren's role within this circle continued to evolve alongside these changes. He was no longer just a source of interpretation. He was becoming a central figure around whom the group's identity was forming. A reference point, a guide. Someone whose understanding shaped not just belief, but direction. This role was not declared. It was accepted. And acceptance, in this context, gave it strength. There were also practical elements that began to reflect this growing structure. Meetings became more organized. Discussions followed clearer patterns. Individuals took on responsibilities that supported the functioning of the group. These responsibilities were not presented as duties. They were framed as contributions to ways of participating more fully. And in that framing, they were embraced. Because contributing to something meaningful reinforces one's connection to it deepens commitment, that it strengthens identity. The inner circle became more cohesive. It also became more self-sustaining. The ideas introduced by Lundgren were reinforced not just by him, but by the group itself. Members echoed his interpretations, supported one another's alignment, and collectively maintained the structure that had formed. This kind of reinforcement creates stability, but it also creates insulation, because when a group begins to validate its own perspective internally, external input becomes less influential, less necessary, and eventually less considered. This insulation was not immediate. It developed gradually, but as it did, the circle became more defined, not by physical boundaries, but by shared understanding. By alignment. By trust in a single guiding voice. Outside, Kirtland remained unchanged. Quiet streets, familiar routines, a sense of calm that suggested nothing out of the ordinary. But within this hidden circle, something was taking shape, something structured, something unified, something that, while built on belief, was beginning to extend beyond it. A system, a network of individuals connected not just by faith, but by a shared dependence on a central interpretation. And as that dependence deepened, so too did the influence of the one who stood at the center of it, quietly, steadily, without resistance. A circle had formed, and within that circle, the boundaries between belief and authority were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish. As the inner circle surrounding Jeffrey Lundgren continued to strengthen in Kirtland, Ohio, the changes that had once seemed subtle began to settle into something more permanent. What had started as shared understanding was becoming shared dependence, and within that shift, the structure of the group grew more defined, though still invisible to anyone outside of it. There is a quiet moment in the evolution of any tightly bound group when belonging begins to outweigh individuality. It doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds through repetition, through reinforcement, through the gradual realization that agreement feels safer than uncertainty. Within this circle, that moment had arrived. Conversations among members began to mirror one another more closely. Ideas that had originated from Lundgren's teachings were repeated, expanded upon, and reinforced within the group itself. Over time, these ideas no longer felt like they belonged to a single source. They felt shared, collective, almost instinctive, and that made them stronger. Because when a belief is echoed by many voices, it gains a sense of validation that extends beyond its origin. This reinforcement created a feedback loop. The more the group aligned with Lundgren's interpretations, the more those interpretations felt correct. And the more correct they felt, the less they were questioned. It was a cycle that deepened with time. Alongside this, the group's interaction with the outside world began to shift in subtle ways. Members still maintained their daily routines, their responsibilities, their outward connections. But internally, their frame of reference was changing. They began to interpret external events through the lens of what they had learned within the circle. Other perspectives, whether from friends, family, or broader society, began to feel less aligned. Not necessarily wrong, but incomplete, lacking the depth that they believed they had found. And over time, this created a quiet distance, not enforced, but felt. The more time individuals spent within the group, the more that distance grew. Conversations outside the circle became less engaging, less meaningful, because they no longer operated within the same framework of understanding. And so, naturally, time spent within the circle increased, because that was where alignment existed, where understanding felt shared, where meaning felt reinforced. Lundgren's role in this continued to expand, not through overt control, but through consistency. His presence remained calm, measured, and unwavering. He did not need to assert authority directly, because by this point, it had already been accepted that he spoke, and others listened that he explained, and others understood he guided, and others followed. Within this dynamic, even small suggestions carried weight. A change in emphasis, a shift in interpretation, a new idea introduced. Each was absorbed and reflected by the group with little resistance, because resistance had gradually been replaced by trust, and trust, when concentrated, can be powerful. It can also be fragile, because it depends on continuity, on the belief that the guiding voice remains consistent, accurate, and aligned with truth. To maintain this continuity, Lundgren began to reinforce not just ideas, but behavior. He emphasized the importance of unity, of staying aligned, of maintaining focus. These concepts were presented as natural extensions of belief, as necessary components of understanding. But they also served another purpose. They maintained cohesion, because within a tightly connected group, cohesion is essential. It keeps the structure intact. It ensures that the shared perspective remains stable. And in this environment, cohesion became something to protect, not through confrontation, but through subtle reinforcement. Agreement was acknowledged, alignment was encouraged, and divergence, when it appeared, was gently redirected. Over time, this created a culture within the circle, one that valued consistency, unity, and trust in the central interpretation. It was not rigid in appearance, but it was firm in practice. And within that culture, Individuality began to soften, not disappear, but adapt, because to remain aligned, individuals adjusted their perspectives, their expressions, their responses, gradually, almost imperceptibly. This adaptation strengthened the group, but it also narrowed the range of perspectives within it. Because when everyone begins to think in similar ways, alternative viewpoints become less visible, less present, and eventually, less considered. There were moments, brief, often internal, when individuals may have sensed this narrowing. A fleeting thought, a quiet question, a subtle recognition that something had changed. But those moments rarely extended beyond thought, because within the environment that had formed, expressing such thoughts would have required stepping outside of alignment. And alignment, by this stage, was deeply valued. The physical space in which the group gathered also began to take on greater significance. It was no longer just a place for discussion. It became a space associated with clarity, with understanding, with purpose. Time spent there felt different, more focused, more meaningful, and this association further reinforced the group's cohesion because it created a sense of place, an environment where their shared understanding was not only discussed, but experienced. Lundgren's teachings during this period also began to include stronger references to structure and order, not just as abstract concepts, but as guiding principles for action. He spoke about the importance of maintaining alignment, of ensuring that each individual contributed to the overall stability of the group. These ideas were presented calmly, logically, without urgency, but their implications were clear. Each person had a role. Each role mattered. And fulfilling that role was part of maintaining the integrity of the whole. This sense of responsibility deepened commitment, because it connected individual actions to a larger purpose. And purpose, when shared, can be incredibly binding. As the circle continued to evolve, it became more than just a group of individuals who believed the same things. It became a system, a structure of relationships, expectations, and shared understanding that operated with increasing cohesion. And within that system, Lundgren remained at the center, not as a distant authority, but as an integral part of the structure itself. A source of direction, a point of reference, a constant presence. Outside, life in Kirtland remained unchanged. The calm rhythm of the town continued, undisturbed by what was developing beneath the surface. There were no visible signs, no outward disruptions, nothing that suggested that anything beyond ordinary activity was taking place. But within the circle, the changes were undeniable. The boundaries had tightened, the alignment had deepened, the influence had grown, and perhaps most significantly, the separation, though still quiet, still subtle, had become more defined, not through walls or distance, but through perspective, through the shared belief that what existed within the circle was complete, and what existed outside of it was not. This belief did not announce itself. It settled. It became part of how the group understood the world. And as it did, it laid the groundwork for what would come next. Because once a group becomes fully aligned, once its structure is stable, its beliefs reinforced, its cohesion strong, the potential for that structure to move in new directions increases. Directions that may not have seemed possible before. Directions that, once taken, can be difficult to reverse. The circle had formed. It had strengthened. It had become something unified. And within that unity, the next shift was already beginning. Quietly, steadily, and without interruption. A shift that would move beyond structure into authority. Chapter 4. Authority without question. There is a point in the evolution of influence where it no longer feels like influence at all. It feels natural. By the time the inner circle around Jeffrey Lundgren had fully settled into its rhythm in Kirtland, Ohio, His presence had become more than central, it had become foundational. Not because it was declared to be so, but because everything within the group increasingly moved in relation to him. What he said shaped discussion. What he emphasized shaped priorities. What he believed shaped reality. And yet, this transformation did not arrive with any dramatic turning point. There was no single moment where authority was claimed. No announcement, no visible shift in structure. Instead, it emerged quietly, carried forward by the very trust that had been built over time. Trust had become acceptance. Acceptance had become reliance, and reliance had become authority. Within the circle, this authority did not feel imposed. It felt earned, logical, even necessary. After all, Lundgren had provided clarity where there had once been uncertainty. He had offered direction where there had once been questions. And in doing so, he had positioned himself, not forcefully, but gradually, as the one who understood, the one who could interpret, the one who could guide. This kind of authority is rarely questioned because it does not feel like authority in the traditional sense. It feels like guidance, like leadership rooted in understanding rather than control, but the effects can be just as powerful. Conversations within the group began to reflect this shift more clearly. Where discussions had once involved multiple perspectives, they now often revolved around Lundgren's interpretations. Members would reference his teachings as a point of clarity, as a way to resolve uncertainty. If he said it, it must be right. That sentiment was rarely spoken aloud, but it was present, and over time, it became embedded. There were fewer debates, fewer moments of disagreement, not because everyone suddenly thought the same way, but because the framework within which they thought had narrowed. Within that framework, Lundgren's voice carried a weight that was difficult to challenge, and challenging it began to feel unnecessary, even uncomfortable. There is a subtle psychological shift that occurs when questioning becomes less frequent. It does not eliminate independent thought entirely, but it changes how that thought is expressed. It encourages alignment over exploration, agreement over uncertainty, and within this group, that shift had taken hold that Lundgren's teachings also began to move beyond interpretation and into instruction. Not overt commands, not rigid directives, but guidance that carried an expectation of being followed. Suggestions that, within the context of the group, felt less like options and more like direction. This change was gradual, but it was significant because it marked a transition from understanding to action. Members began to look to him not just for explanation, but for decisions. For clarity on what should be done, how situations should be handled, how alignment should be maintained. And each time that guidance was followed, it reinforced his position that it confirmed that his role was not only to interpret truth, but to direct behavior. This reinforcement created a cycle. The more his guidance was followed, the more it was trusted. The more it was trusted, the more it was sought. And the more it was sought, the more central it became. Within this cycle, authority strengthened, not through force, but through repetition. There were also changes in how the group responded to external influences. Where once outside perspectives had been considered, even if only briefly, they now began to feel less relevant. Not because they were explicitly rejected, but because they did not align with the clarity that had been established within the group. This created a kind of intellectual insulation, a space where ideas circulated internally, reinforced by shared understanding and rarely challenged by outside input. And within that space, Lundgren's authority remained unchallenged. Because there was nothing present to challenge it, he also began to emphasize the importance of consistency, of maintaining alignment not just in belief, but in behavior. He spoke about discipline, about the need to remain focused, about the risks of deviation. These ideas were framed as logical extensions of understanding, but they also served to reinforce control, because within a system that values consistency, deviation becomes noticeable, and noticeable deviation invites correction, not harshly, not aggressively, but steadily, and over time. This creates an environment where individuals self-regulate, where they adjust their thoughts and actions to remain aligned, often without needing direct instruction. This self-regulation is one of the most powerful forms of control because it does not require constant enforcement that IT is maintained from within. Within the group, this dynamic was becoming increasingly evident. Members began to monitor not only their own alignment, but that of others. Subtle cues, tone, agreement, participation were observed and responded to. Again, not with confrontation, but with reinforcement, encouragement toward alignment, that a quiet return to the established perspective. And in this way, the group maintained its cohesion. Lundgren's role in this process remained calm, measured, and consistent. He did not need to intervene frequently because the structure itself had become self-sustaining. His presence alone was often enough to guide the direction of discussion, to set the tone, to reinforce expectations. This is how authority, once established, begins to operate effortlessly, not through constant assertion, but through quiet presence, through the understanding that direction comes from a single source, and that source does not need to raise its voice. IT only needs to speak. Outside, nothing appeared different. Kirtland, Ohio remained as it had always been, calm, steady, unassuming. Life continued in its familiar patterns, untouched by the internal shifts taking place within this small, tightly connected group. But within that group, the transformation was complete. Authority had taken hold, not visibly, not forcefully, but undeniably. And perhaps most importantly, it had taken hold without resistance, because it had never felt like something to resist. That IT had felt like something to trust, something to follow, something that, over time, had become inseparable from the idea of truth itself. And when authority becomes indistinguishable from truth, it no longer needs to justify itself. That IT simply exists, quietly, steadily, guiding everything that follows. By the time authority had fully settled around Jeffrey Lundgren within the quiet boundaries of Kirtland, Ohio, it no longer required reinforcement through explanation. It had become understood, absorbed into the rhythm of the group, embedded in its structure, reflected in its behavior. What had once been guidance was now expectation, and expectation, when consistently met, becomes habit. Within the circle, this habit shaped everything. Conversations no longer drifted freely between ideas. They moved with direction, often anticipating Lundgren's perspective before it was even expressed. There was a noticeable shift in tone, less exploratory, more affirming. Words were chosen carefully, responses aligned instinctively, and agreement came more quickly than before. IT wasn't rehearsed, IT was learned. This is how environments evolve when authority becomes central. Individuals begin to internalize the structure around them. They adapt, not consciously, not deliberately, but through repetition, through observation, through the quiet understanding of what maintains harmony. And harmony, within this group, had become essential. Lundgren reinforced this without needing to say it directly. His presence alone carried enough weight to shape the atmosphere. When he entered a room, conversations subtly adjusted. Focus sharpened. Attention shifted, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Recognition that he was the one who defined direction. There were moments when he would introduce new interpretations or expand on existing ones. And in those moments, the group responded with a kind of quiet attentiveness. Not just listening, but absorbing. as though each word carried significance beyond its immediate meaning. And in many ways, it did, because within this structure, his words were not simply ideas. They were instructions, even when they were not framed that way. This distinction is important. Lundgren rarely gave direct commands. He did not need to. Instead, he presented ideas in a way that implied action. He described what alignment looked like, what consistency required, what understanding demanded. And from those descriptions, actions naturally followed. Because once individuals accept a framework as truth, their behavior begins to align with it, often without needing explicit direction. Within the group, this alignment became increasingly visible. Members adjusted their routines, their priorities, even their relationships in ways that reflected the structure Lundgren had established. Decisions were made with consideration of how they fit within that framework, not because they were told to, but because it felt right, because it felt consistent, and consistency had become a measure of belief. There was also a growing sense of accountability, not imposed from above, but shared among members. Individuals began to observe one another more closely, not with suspicion, but with a quiet awareness of alignment. If someone seemed uncertain, it was noticed. If someone's perspective shifted, it was gently addressed. If someone's commitment appeared to waver, it was quietly reinforced. This dynamic created a self-regulating system. Point 1, where the group maintained its own cohesion, often without needing direct intervention from Lundgren himself. And that made the structure even more stable, because it no longer relied solely on one voice. It was supported by many. Yet at the center of it all, Lundgren remained the source, the reference point, the one whose interpretations defined the framework within which everything else operated. As this system matured, the boundaries between personal belief and group expectation became increasingly blurred. Individuals no longer distinguished between what they thought and what the group believed, because the two had become aligned. And within that alignment, questioning became rare, not discouraged overtly, but unnecessary, because there was nothing within the structure that suggested the need for it. Lundgren's teachings during this time also began to include stronger emphasis on consequences, not in a dramatic or threatening way, but as logical outcomes. He spoke about the importance of maintaining order, of avoiding deviation, of staying aligned with truth. Deviation, he suggested, led to confusion. Disorder, instability. And within a group that valued clarity and structure, these were outcomes to be avoided. This framing made alignment not just preferable, but essential, because it connected belief to outcome. It suggested that maintaining consistency was not just about agreement, but about preserving stability itself. And so, alignment deepened, not through force, but through understanding. There were also subtle shifts in how time was spent. More hours were dedicated to gatherings, discussions, and shared activities. The group became not just a part of life, but a central part of it. And as this happened, external connections began to fade in importance, not intentionally, but naturally, because when one environment provides clarity, purpose, and belonging, other environments can begin to feel less significant, less aligned, less necessary. This gradual shift further strengthened the group's cohesion, because it reduced competing influences. It simplified perspective. It allowed the internal structure to remain consistent, and within that consistency, Lundgren's authority remained unquestioned. Outside of this circle, nothing appeared unusual. Kirtland, Ohio continued its quiet existence, untouched by the internal dynamics unfolding within this small group. There were no visible signs, no disruptions, no indicators that anything beyond ordinary activity was taking place. But within the group, the transformation was complete. Authority had become embedded. Control had become normalized, alignment had become instinctive, and perhaps most significantly, the system had reached a point where it no longer needed to justify itself. It simply functioned, quietly, efficiently, with each individual contributing to its stability, and within that stability, a new phase was beginning to take shape, because once authority is fully accepted, once it becomes part of the foundation rather than something that stands above it, the possibilities for what that authority can direct begin to expand, directions that may not have been considered before, actions that may not have seemed possible, all guided by a structure that, to those within it, felt not only stable, but necessary. The circle had become complete, the authority within it, absolute. And from that point forward, what unfolded would no longer be shaped by uncertainty, but by direction. Chapter 5. The Family That Stood Apart. By the time the structure surrounding Jeffrey Lundgren had become steady and unquestioned within his inner circle in Kirtland, Ohio, a new dynamic began to emerge, one that would slowly, almost quietly, introduce tension into an otherwise unified system. Up until this point, the group had moved in alignment. Differences were minimal, questions rare, and cohesion strong. But systems built on uniformity often encounter their first real test not from outside pressure, but from within. And in this case, that test would come in the form of a single family. The family was not initially seen as separate. They had attended gatherings, listened to teachings, and participated much like others in the group. On the surface, there was no immediate indication that they would become distinct from the rest. But over time, subtle differences began to appear. Not dramatic disagreements, not open resistance, just small variations in perspective. Moments where interpretation did not fully align. Questions that lingered a little longer than expected. These moments, at first, passed without much notice. In a group that had become accustomed to agreement, small differences could easily blend into the background. But as the structure around Lundgren continued to solidify, those differences began to stand out more clearly, because in an environment built on alignment, even slight misalignment becomes visible. The family, while still present within the group, began to occupy a different space, not physically, but perceptually. They were still part of the circle, but not fully within its center. Their presence introduced a subtle contrast, a variation that quietly disrupted the uniformity that had been established. And within a tightly aligned system, contrast can feel significant. It can raise unspoken questions. It can create uncertainty, not necessarily about the belief itself, but about the stability of the group. That Lundgren's response to this was not immediate, nor was it overt. He did not confront the family directly, nor did he single them out in any obvious way. Instead, he began to emphasize certain themes within his teachings, themes that, while general in nature, carried implications that resonated with the situation. But he spoke more frequently about unity, about the importance of shared understanding, about the risks of deviation. These ideas were presented calmly, without urgency, but they carried a clear message. Alignment was not optional. It was essential. Within the group, these messages were received with quiet agreement. Members, already accustomed to maintaining cohesion, responded by reinforcing their own alignment. Discussions became more focused, more consistent, more reflective of the established framework, and within this environment, the family's differences became more noticeable, not because they had changed, but because the group around them had become more defined. There is a certain pressure that exists within unified systems, a pressure not always expressed, but deeply felt. It is the pressure to belong, to remain aligned, to avoid standing apart. For most, this pressure is subtle. For those who find themselves slightly outside of alignment, it can be more pronounced. the family began to experience this in quiet ways. Conversations that once felt natural now carried an undercurrent of expectation. Their perspectives, while still heard, were met with gentle redirection. Their questions, while not dismissed, were often answered in ways that guided them back toward the central interpretation. This was not confrontation. It was correction, soft, measured, consistent, and over time, this kind of correction can feel isolating because it suggests that one's understanding is not fully aligned, not fully complete. Within the group, this dynamic began to influence interactions. Members, consciously or not, adjusted their responses when engaging with the family. There was a tendency to reinforce the established perspective more firmly, to guide conversations toward agreement, to maintain the cohesion that had become so important. And in doing so, the distance grew, not dramatically, but steadily. The family was still present, still participating, but increasingly aware that their perspective did not fully match that of the group. Lundgren's teachings during this time also began to introduce stronger language around the idea of purity, not in a physical sense, but in a conceptual one. He spoke about the importance of maintaining clarity, of ensuring that understanding remained unclouded by external or conflicting interpretations. These ideas, again, were not directed at anyone specifically, but within the context of the group, their implications were clear. Deviation, even in small forms, could affect the whole, and within a system that valued unity. Protecting that unity became a priority. This emphasis subtly shifted how the group perceived difference. What had once been seen as variation began to be viewed as potential disruption, not necessarily intentional, but still significant. And within that perception, the family's position became more defined. They were no longer just part of the group. They were slightly outside of alignment. This distinction was never formally stated, but it was felt in conversations, in interactions, in the quiet adjustments that took place when perspectives did not fully match. For the family, this created a growing sense of separation, not enforced, not declared, but experienced through the subtle cues that had become part of the group's dynamic. And for the group, it created a new challenge, because maintaining unity now required addressing difference, even if that difference was small, even if it was unintentional. Lundgren's role in this remained consistent. He did not escalate the situation. He did not create conflict. Instead, he continued to reinforce the principles that had guided the group: unity, alignment, clarity. But within those principles, there was now an added layer: the understanding that not everyone may be fully aligned, and that alignment must be maintained. This understanding began to shape the group's perception of the family in subtle ways, not with hostility, not with rejection, but with a quiet awareness that they represented something different, something that did not fully fit within the structure that had been built. And within a system that had become so cohesive, even small differences can feel significant because they challenge the very thing that holds the system together. Unity, the family, in their quiet divergence, had introduced that challenge. Not intentionally, not dramatically, but undeniably. And as that challenge continued to exist within the group, it began to set the stage for a deeper shift. One that would move beyond perception into decision. As the quiet tension surrounding the family continued to develop within the circle in Kirtland, Ohio, the shift was no longer just perceptual, it was becoming structural. What had begun as subtle differences in interpretation was now shaping how the group functioned, how it responded, and most importantly, how it decided. The presence of a single misalignment, even a small one, had begun to influence the balance that Jeffrey Lundgren had carefully cultivated. And within that balance, stability had always been the priority. There is a certain fragility in systems built on uniformity. They appear strong, cohesive, consistent, unified, but their strength often depends on the absence of contradiction. When contradiction appears, even in quiet forms, it introduces something unfamiliar, uncertainty, not necessarily about belief itself, but about how to maintain it in the presence of difference. For Lundgren, this was not a problem to be confronted directly, it was something to be interpreted, and slowly, his language began to reflect a deeper framing of the situation, not as a simple difference in perspective, but as something more significant within the structure of belief itself. He spoke increasingly about order, about alignment not just as a preference, but as a requirement for maintaining clarity. And within this framing, deviation began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer just variation. It was potential disruption. These ideas were presented calmly, without accusation, without urgency. But within the context of the group, they carried a growing weight. Members began to internalize this perspective, viewing alignment not just as a shared value, but as something that needed to be protected, and protection, even when subtle, changes behavior. Conversations around the family became more careful, not openly critical, but quietly observant. Their words, their tone, their responses, everything was noticed more closely than before, not with hostility, but with awareness. This awareness created a quiet shift in how the family was perceived. They were still part of the group, but no longer fully integrated within it. Their presence carried a sense of uncertainty, not about who they were, but about how they fit. And within a system that valued clarity, uncertainty could not remain unresolved. Lundgren's teachings during this time began to include more references to responsibility, not just individual responsibility, but collective responsibility. He emphasized that maintaining the integrity of the group was not the task of one person, but of everyone within it. This idea resonated deeply because it distributed the weight of alignment across the entire group. Each member became, in a sense, a guardian of the system, and within that role, attention to difference became more pronounced. It wasn't enforced, it wasn't directed, but it was present. Members began to respond more quickly to moments of misalignment. Conversations were gently guided back toward agreement. Differences were addressed not as opposing views, but as misunderstandings that required correction. And over time, this created an environment where divergence became increasingly difficult to sustain, because it was always met with redirection, always brought back into alignment. For the family, this environment grew more complex. Their presence within the group remained, but their position within it became more uncertain. They were still included, but not fully embraced in the same way as before. There was a quiet distance now, not visible, but felt. And in that distance, something began to shift, not just in how the group saw them, but in how Lundgren framed their role within the larger structure. He began to speak about testing, not in direct terms, not tied to any specific individual, but as a concept. He described moments where belief is challenged, where alignment is tested, where clarity must be reaffirmed. These ideas introduced a new layer of meaning to the situation, because they suggested that difference was not random. It was purposeful, part of a larger process. This framing changed how the group interpreted the family's position. They were no longer just individuals with slightly different perspectives. They became part of a narrative, a representation of something that needed to be understood, addressed, and ultimately resolved. This shift was subtle, but significant, because once individuals are seen as part of a larger narrative, their role within that narrative begins to define how they are perceived. And within this narrative, alignment remained the central theme. Lundgren also began to emphasize the idea of loyalty, not in explicit terms, but as an extension of belief. He spoke about commitment, about staying true to understanding, about the importance of maintaining focus even when faced with uncertainty. These ideas reinforced the group's cohesion, but they also created a contrast, because within that framework, any deviation, no matter how small, could be seen as a lack of alignment, a gap in understanding, or something that required correction. This did not lead to immediate action. There was no sudden change, but the groundwork was being laid. The way the group saw the family was evolving. The way Lundgren framed their role was becoming more defined. And within that definition, the space for difference was narrowing. There were moments, quiet and brief, where the situation might have shifted in another direction. Moments where perspective could have broadened, where difference could have been accepted as part of the group's dynamic. But those moments passed, because within the structure that had formed, acceptance of difference was not aligned with the emphasis on unity, and unity remained the priority. Outside, nothing had changed. Kirtland, Ohio continued to move at its usual pace, untouched by the internal dynamics unfolding within this small group. There were no visible signs, no outward tension, nothing that suggested that anything beyond ordinary activity was taking place. But within the group, the shift was clear. The family had moved from being part of the circle to standing just outside its center, not removed, not excluded, but no longer fully aligned. And within a system built on alignment, that position carried meaning. It introduced tension. It raised questions. And most importantly, it created a situation that, within the logic of the group, could not remain unresolved, because in a structure where unity defines stability, anything that stands apart must eventually be addressed. The question was not if, but how. And as this quiet tension continued to build, as perception shifted and the narrative around the family became more defined, the path forward was beginning to take shape, not clearly, not immediately, but steadily, guided by a system that no longer tolerated uncertainty and an authority that no longer required questioning. Chapter 6: Seeds of Suspicion. By the time the family's quiet separation had become part of the group's internal landscape in Kirtland, Ohio, the atmosphere surrounding Jeffrey Lundgren and his followers had shifted once again, this time into something more subtle, yet far more consequential. What had once been unity was now guarded unity, and with that change came something new: suspicion, not open distrust, not confrontation, but a quiet awareness that something within the system was no longer perfectly aligned. Suspicion, in environments like this, rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with accusations or visible tension. Instead, it settles in gradually, shaping perception in ways that are often difficult to notice at first. A pause in conversation, a moment of hesitation, a subtle shift in tone. These were the kinds of changes that began to appear. The family, still present within the group, became the focal point of this shift, not through anything they actively did, but through how they were now perceived. Their slight differences in perspective, once barely noticeable, were now viewed through a new lens, a lens shaped by the emphasis on alignment, unity, and order. And within that lens, difference began to carry meaning beyond itself. It became something to interpret. Lundgren's role in this transformation was, as before, measured and deliberate. He did not introduce suspicion directly. He did not name it, define it, or direct it toward anyone in particular. Instead, he began to speak more frequently about discernment, about the importance of recognizing what aligns and what is not. He framed this not as judgment, but as understanding. As awareness, as the ability to perceive truth more clearly. These ideas were subtle but powerful, because they encouraged individuals to observe more closely, to evaluate more carefully, to look not just at what was said, but at how it fit within the larger structure of belief, and within that evaluation, the families. Differences became more significant, not because they had changed, but because the way they were being seen had changed. Members began to notice things that might have previously gone unnoticed. A hesitation in agreement, a different interpretation of a concept, a tone that suggested uncertainty rather than certainty. These observations were not discussed openly. They did not need to be. They were understood, and in that understanding, a quiet narrative began to form that something was not fully aligned. This narrative was not built on evidence in the traditional sense, that it was built on perception, that on interpretation, that on the framework that had already been established within the group. And within that framework, alignment was clear and misalignment stood out. There is a particular dynamic that emerges when suspicion takes root in a tightly unified system. It does not create immediate division. Instead, it creates heightened awareness, a constant, low-level attentiveness to difference, and over time, that attentiveness can shape behavior. Members became more cautious in their interactions. Conversations were more deliberate. Words were chosen with greater care, not just to express belief, but to ensure that belief was clearly aligned. And in doing so, the contrast with the family became more pronounced, not through confrontation, but through consistency. Because when one group becomes more aligned, even small deviations become more visible. Lundgren continued to guide this process without overt direction. His teachings emphasized clarity, precision, and the importance of recognizing truth in its purest form. He spoke about the need to remain vigilant, not in a fearful sense, but in a focused one. To stay aware, to remain aligned, to ensure that understanding was not diluted. These ideas reinforced the group's cohesion, but they also created an environment where deviation, however minor, could not go unnoticed. And within that environment, the family's position became increasingly defined. They were no longer just slightly different. They were uncertain, and uncertainty within this system was not neutral. It was something to be addressed, something to be understood, something that required resolution. This shift in perception began to influence how the group interacted with the family on a deeper level. Conversations, while still calm and respectful on the surface, carried an undercurrent of evaluation. Responses were measured not just for content, but for alignment. And when alignment was not fully present, it was quietly noted, not recorded, not discussed openly, but remembered. Over time, these small observations began to accumulate, not in a formal way, but in perception. In the shared understanding of the group. And as they accumulated, they reinforced the narrative that had begun to take shape. That something was not fully aligned, that something needed to be understood, and within that understanding, the role of Lundgren became even more central. Because if there was uncertainty, then clarity would come from him. If there was misalignment, then it would be interpreted through his teachings. If there was something to be resolved, then he would define how. This dynamic further strengthened his authority, because it positioned him not just as a guide, but as the one who could interpret the meaning of difference itself. And within that role, his influence deepened. Outside the quiet town of Kirtland, Ohio remained unchanged. There were no visible signs of tension, no outward disruptions, no indication that anything beyond ordinary activity was taking place. But within the group, the atmosphere had shifted. It was still calm, still structured, still unified. But now, it was also watchful, attentive, aware. The seeds of suspicion had been planted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. And as with all things that grow in quiet places, they did not remain small. They began to spread influence perception, shape, understanding. And within that process, the group was moving further away from simple belief and closer to something else, something more defined, more controlled, more consequential. Because once suspicion becomes part of a system, it changes how that system operates. That IT introduces a new layer. Point one that looks not just for alignment, but for deviation. And once deviation is identified, it becomes something that must be addressed. The question was no longer whether the family was different, that had already been established. The question now was what that difference meant, and what, within the structure of the group, should be done about it. As the quiet atmosphere within the group continued to shift in Kirtland, Ohio, the subtle awareness that had taken root around the family began to evolve into something more defined. Suspicion, once a faint and unspoken presence, was no longer just a feeling. It was becoming a framework through which behavior, tone, and even silence were interpreted. And within that framework, Jeffrey Lundgren remained the central interpreter. There is a critical moment in tightly aligned systems when observation turns into meaning, when small details are no longer simply noticed, but analyzed, when actions are no longer neutral, but symbolic. That moment had arrived. The group's perception of the family was no longer based on individual interactions alone. It was now shaped by a growing narrative, one that connected their perceived differences to larger ideas about alignment, clarity, and purpose. Lundgren did not construct this narrative openly, he guided it through language that emphasized deeper interpretation, through ideas that suggested that events, behaviors, and even attitudes could carry meaning beyond their surface appearance. That he spoke about patterns, about the importance of recognizing signs, about understanding not just what is visible, but what lies beneath. These concepts encouraged the group to look more closely, not just at the family, but at everything, to move beyond simple observation and into interpretation. And within that shift, meaning began to form. A hesitation in speech became uncertainty, that a different perspective became misalignment, that a lack of immediate agreement became a sign of incomplete understanding. These interpretations were not forced. They emerged naturally within the framework that had been established. Because once individuals are taught to look for deeper meaning, they begin to find it, even in the smallest details. And as they found it, the narrative strengthened. The family was no longer just slightly different. They were becoming something more defined within the group's understanding. A point of contrast, a source of uncertainty, something that, within the logic of the system, required explanation. This shift had a profound effect on the group's internal dynamics. Conversations became more than exchanges of ideas. They became moments of evaluation. Each interaction carried an added layer of significance, as though something important might be revealed within it. Members listened more carefully, observed more closely, and responded with greater intention, because within this environment, maintaining alignment was no longer just about belief. It was about perception, about ensuring that one's thoughts, words, and actions clearly reflected the structure that had been established. This created a heightened sense of awareness, one that extended beyond the family and into the group as a whole. Individuals became more conscious of how they expressed themselves, more attentive to how they were perceived. And in doing so, they reinforced the system, because when everyone is focused on alignment, alignment becomes stronger, but it also becomes more fragile, because the more it is emphasized, the less room there is for variation, and within that narrowing space, the family's position became increasingly difficult to reconcile. Lundgren's teachings during this period reflected a deeper layer of interpretation. He spoke about purpose, not just in general terms, but in ways that suggested that every element within a system has a role, that nothing exists without meaning, that everything, when properly understood, contributes to a larger design. These ideas added weight to the situation because they implied that the family's presence and their perceived misalignment was not random. It had a place within the system, a purpose that needed to be understood. This framing changed how the group approached the situation. It was no longer about difference. It was about meaning, about what that difference represented, and how it fit within the structure that had been built. This is where suspicion deepens, when it is no longer just about noticing something unusual, but about assigning significance to it. And once significance is assigned, it becomes difficult to ignore. The group began to see the family not just as individuals, but as part of a larger narrative, one that required interpretation and, eventually, resolution. This narrative was not spoken directly. It did not need to be. It existed in the shared understanding of the group, reinforced through conversations, through teachings, through the quiet alignment of perspective. And within that shared understanding, Lundgren's role became even more central, because if there was meaning to be uncovered, he was the one who would reveal it. If there was a purpose to be understood, he was the one who would define it. If there was a path forward, he was the one who would guide it. This further elevated his authority, not just as a teacher, but as an interpreter of reality itself. And within that role, his influence became absolute. The family, meanwhile, remained within the group, but increasingly at its edge. Their interactions continued, but now within an environment that had shifted around them. An environment where their words carried added weight, where their actions were viewed through a lens that sought meaning beyond the surface. This created a quiet tension, not visible, not confrontational, but present. And in that presence, the situation continued to evolve. There were no sudden changes or dramatic events. Just a steady progression, a deepening of interpretation, a strengthening of narrative, a narrowing of perspective. Outside, Kirtland, Ohio remained as calm as ever. The streets were quiet, the routines unchanged, the outward appearance of normalcy intact. But within the group, something significant had taken shape. Suspicion had moved beyond observation. It had become understanding. Not necessarily accurate understanding, but a shared one. A framework through which difference was interpreted and meaning assigned. And within that framework, the next step was already forming. Because once something is given meaning, it invites action. It requires resolution. It demands direction. The group had reached a point where the family's presence could no longer remain simply observed. It had to be understood. And once understood, it would have to be addressed. The quiet atmosphere remained. The calm tone persisted. But beneath it, something had changed, something that would shape everything that followed. The seeds of suspicion had not only taken root, they had begun to grow. Chapter 7. The Doctrine of Elimination. By the time the atmosphere within the group had shifted from quiet suspicion to shared interpretation, something deeper began to take form in Kirtland, Ohio, something that would move beyond perception, beyond narrative, and into belief that carried direction. Within the teachings of Jeffrey Lundgren, a new layer began to emerge, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the same calm, steady tone that had defined everything up to this point. He began to speak more frequently about purification, not in a literal sense, but as a principle. A concept tied to clarity, to order, to the idea that systems, whether spiritual or structural, function best when they are free from confusion, from contradiction, from anything that disrupts their alignment. First, these ideas were abstract, philosophical, presented as part of a broader understanding of how belief systems maintain integrity. But within the context of the group, they carried deeper implications because the group had already identified something that felt out of alignment, the family, and now the language surrounding alignment was beginning to evolve. Lundgren spoke about the importance of maintaining a clear path, of ensuring that understanding remained focused and undistorted. He described how even small deviations, if left unaddressed, could affect the whole, not immediately, but over time. This idea resonated strongly within the group because it aligned with everything they had already experienced: the emphasis on unity, the awareness of difference, the growing narrative around meaning and purpose. Now, all of these elements were being brought together under a single concept: that alignment must be preserved, and that preservation sometimes required action. Still, there were no direct statements, no explicit instructions, only ideas, carefully presented, calmly explained. But within those ideas, something was changing. The group began to internalize the concept that maintaining clarity was not passive, it was active, that it required attention, awareness, and at times, intervention. This was a significant shift because it moved the group from observation to responsibility. They were no longer just noticing misalignment. They were beginning to feel accountable for it. Lundgren reinforced this through his discussions of order. He described systems, both natural and spiritual, as structures that rely on balance. When that balance is disrupted, he explained, the system must respond, not out of emotion, but out of necessity. This framing was crucial because it removed the idea of personal judgment and replaced it with structural reasoning. It wasn't about individuals. It was about maintaining the system. And within that system, every element had a role, but not every element remained in that role indefinitely. Some, he suggested, could become misaligned. And when that happened, the system had to adjust. These ideas were presented with a sense of calm logic, no urgency, no intensity. Just a steady explanation of how things functioned and how they should. But within the group, the implications were becoming clearer because the concept of adjustment, within the context of misalignment, began to take on weight. What did it mean to adjust the system? What did it require? These questions were not asked openly, but they existed, and within the framework that had been established, they were already beginning to find answers. Lundgren also began to emphasize the idea of higher understanding, that there were levels to perception, and that those who were fully aligned could see things that others could not. This created a distinction within the group, not just between those inside and outside, but between those who fully understood and those who were still developing that understanding. And within that distinction, Lundgren positioned himself clearly as the one who saw, who understood, who could interpret what others might not yet fully grasp. This further strengthened his authority because it meant that even if something did not immediately make sense, it could still be accepted as part of a larger truth, a truth that would become clear over time. This idea allowed the group to move forward without needing full clarity in every moment. They trusted that understanding would come, because it always had before. Within this environment, the concept of elimination, though not yet named directly, began to take shape, not as an action, but as an idea, a logical extension of the principles that had been introduced. If alignment must be maintained, if misalignment disrupts the system, if the system must adjust, then certain outcomes begin to feel inevitable, not forced, but necessary. This is how belief systems evolve into direction, not through sudden decisions, but through gradual reasoning, through the layering of ideas until they form a path that feels clear, even if it was never explicitly defined. The group, now deeply aligned and fully immersed in this framework, began to move closer to that path, not consciously, not deliberately, but steadily. Their conversations reflected this shift. While still calm and measured, they carried a deeper sense of purpose. Discussions about alignment, about clarity, about maintaining the integrity of the group became more frequent, and within those discussions, the family remained an unspoken reference point, not named, not directly addressed, but present.as, an example.as, a contrast.as, something that fit within the framework being described. This presence gave the abstract ideas a kind of quiet reality. They were no longer just concepts. They were connected to something tangible, something within the group, and that connection made them more immediate, more relevant, more significant. Outside, Kirtland, Ohio remained unchanged. The calm rhythm of daily life continued, untouched by the internal evolution of this small, tightly connected group. But within that group, the shift was undeniable. Belief was no longer just about understanding. It was about maintaining structure, preserving clarity, ensuring alignment. And within that framework, the idea that action might be required was beginning to feel logical, not emotional, not reactive, but reasoned. And reason, when shaped by a closed system, can lead to conclusions that feel inevitable. The foundation had been laid, the framework established, the reasoning introduced, and now the next step was beginning to form, quietly, steadily, without interruption. A doctrine, not yet spoken in full, but already understood in part. Point 1, that would move beyond belief into action. As the framework within the group continued to solidify in Kirtland, Ohio, the ideas that Jeffrey Lundgren had introduced were no longer abstract principles floating in discussion. They were beginning to settle into something more defined, something directional. What had once been described in broad terms, alignment, clarity, order, was now being interpreted with greater specificity by those within the circle. The group no longer needed every idea to be explained in detail. They had reached a point where implication carried as much weight as instruction, and within those implications, the next step began to take shape. That Lundgren's teachings grew quieter in tone, yet heavier in meaning. He spoke less frequently, but when he did, his words seemed to carry a deeper sense of finality, not urgency, but resolution. As though the questions that had once surrounded the group's evolving understanding were now being replaced with answers that did not invite discussion, only acceptance. That he returned often to the concept of necessity, not framed as personal desire, but as structural requirement. He described how systems, when functioning correctly, naturally correct themselves. That imbalance, when recognized, leads to adjustment, not out of choice, but out of design. This framing removed hesitation, because if something is necessary, it does not require debate. That it requires action. Within the group, this idea settled with a quiet weight. There were no dramatic reactions, no visible shifts in behavior, but internally, something aligned. A shared understanding that had been forming for some time was now reaching a point of clarity, not spoken, but understood. The family, still present yet increasingly distant in perception, became central to this understanding, not as individuals, but as part of the system being discussed. Their perceived misalignment was no longer just an observation. It was now part of a structure that required resolution. And within that structure, the path forward began to feel inevitable. Lundgren did not issue commands that he did not need to. Instead, he reinforced the logic that had already been built. He spoke about responsibility, not as an individual burden, but as a collective one. That those who understood must also act in accordance with that understanding. That awareness carries obligation, and obligation, when accepted, leads to action. These ideas deepened the group's sense of purpose. They were no longer just participants in a belief system. They were stewards of it. responsible for maintaining its integrity, for ensuring that alignment was preserved. And within that responsibility, hesitation began to fade, because hesitation implies uncertainty, and uncertainty within this system had already been addressed. There was also a shift in how time was experienced within the group. Conversations became more focused, more deliberate. Silence carried more meaning. It was no longer empty. It was reflective, filled with shared understanding that did not need to be spoken. This kind of silence can be powerful because it suggests agreement without words. It reinforces alignment without discussion. And within that silence, decisions can begin to form, not individually, but collectively. Lundgren's presence during this period remained calm, composed, and unwavering. He did not display emotion in ways that would suggest conflict or tension. Instead, he maintained the same steady tone that had guided the group from the beginning. And in that consistency, he provided reassurance. Because if the one who understood remained calm, then what was unfolding must be part of that understanding. This dynamic allowed the group to move forward without resistance. Even as the implications of their shared beliefs grew more significant, they did not experience them as sudden or alarming. They experienced them as natural, the next step in a process that had been unfolding all along. There were moments, brief, internal, where the weight of what was being considered might have surfaced. A flicker of hesitation, a quiet awareness of consequence. But within the structure that had been built, those moments did not linger, because the framework provided clarity. It offered explanation. It resolved uncertainty. And in doing so, it allowed the group to continue moving forward. The concept of elimination, though still not explicitly named, had now fully formed within the logic of the system. It was no longer an abstract possibility. It was a conclusion. A result of reasoning. A step that followed naturally from the principles that had been established. And because it was framed as necessary, it did not feel extreme. It felt required. This is how systems can lead individuals to decisions they might not otherwise consider, not through pressure, but through logic that feels complete, through belief that feels certain, through a structure that leaves little room for alternative perspectives. Within this system, the path forward had become clear, not in detail, but in direction. The group understood what needed to be done, even if the specifics had not yet been fully articulated. And within that understanding, a quiet agreement began to settle, not spoken, not declared, but present. Outside, Kirtland, Ohio remained as it always had, calm, quiet, unaware. The ordinary rhythm of life continued, untouched by the internal decisions forming within this small, isolated group. But within that group, the transformation was complete. Belief had become structure. Structure had become authority. Authority had become direction. And direction was now leading toward action. The doctrine, once a collection of ideas, had become something more. A guiding principle. A framework for decision. A path that, to those within it, felt not only justified, but inevitable. And as that path became clearer, as the final pieces of understanding fell into place, the group stood on the edge of something that would move beyond thought, beyond discussion, into reality, quietly, deliberately, without hesitation. Chapter 8. The Plan Beneath the Surface. By the time the internal logic of the group had settled into quiet certainty, something began to take shape beneath the surface in Kirtland, Ohio. Not visible, not spoken openly, but present in the way people moved, in the way they listened, in the way they no longer asked certain questions. Within the influence of Jeffrey Lundgren, the group had reached a point where belief no longer required reinforcement. It had become assumed, understood, embedded in every interaction. And when belief reaches that level, Action does not need to be announced that IT begins quietly. The atmosphere during this time remained calm, almost unchanged to an outside observer. Conversations still took place in measured tones. Gatherings continued with the same structure. There were no sudden shifts, no outward signs that anything significant was forming. But beneath that calm surface, something had begun to organize itself, not through commands, but through alignment. Members of the group began to spend more time together, not just in discussions, but in shared presence. There was a subtle increase in coordination, unspoken, yet noticeable to those within it. Movements became more intentional, interactions more focused. That IT was as if everyone understood that something was approaching, even if it had not yet been defined. This kind of shared awareness is difficult to describe. That IT does not rely on explicit communication. The IT exists in silence, in understanding, in the quiet recognition that all parts of a system are moving toward the same point. That Lundgren's role during this period reflected that same quiet precision. He did not introduce new ideas. He did not expand on the framework that had already been established. Instead, he allowed it to settle. To solidify. To become something that no longer needed explanation. Because by this point, explanation was no longer necessary. The group already understood, and that understanding created a kind of readiness, not urgent, not anxious, but present. A readiness that did not need to be expressed to be felt. Within this environment, the idea of preparation began to take on meaning, not as a separate concept, but as a natural extension of what had already been accepted. If action was inevitable, then preparation was simply the step before it. And so, without formal discussion, preparation began. In small ways, subtle ways, ways that, on their own, might not have seemed significant. Time was organized differently. Interactions became more deliberate. Certain conversations were held more privately, not secretively, but selectively. This selectivity created a quiet layering within the group. While everyone remained aligned, some individuals began to take on more central roles in the unfolding process. Not officially, not visibly, but through proximity. Proximity to Lundgren. His presence. The quiet direction that guided everything. These individuals, often the most deeply aligned, seemed to move with a clearer sense of purpose. Their actions were steady, composed, and coordinated in ways that suggested an understanding that went beyond words. And within the group, this did not stand out as unusual. It felt appropriate. Because within a structured system, roles naturally emerge, and those roles are accepted without question. The family, meanwhile, remained within the same space, physically present, yet increasingly distant in every other sense. Their position had not changed outwardly, but within the internal structure of the group, they had become something else entirely. A point of focus. A part of the system that had already been interpreted, already been assigned meaning. And within that meaning, their presence was no longer neutral. It was part of what needed to be addressed. This understanding existed without being spoken. It moved through the group like a current, quiet, steady, impossible to see, but impossible to ignore. There were no discussions about what would happen. No planning sessions. No explicit coordination. Because within the framework that had been built, none of that was required. The path had already been defined, and once a path is defined, movement along it becomes natural, almost inevitable. Lundgren's influence during this phase was perhaps at its most subtle and most complete. He no longer needed to guide conversations or reinforce ideas. His presence alone was enough to maintain alignment, and within that presence, direction existed, not as instruction, but as understanding. This is where influence becomes absolute, when it no longer needs to assert itself, when it exists simply as the foundation upon which everything else rests. The group had reached that point, and within that foundation, the plan, though never formally outlined, was taking shape, not as a series of steps, but as a shared direction, a movement towards something that all understood, even if it had not been spoken aloud. There is a quiet intensity in moments like these, a stillness that exists just before something changes, not a dramatic pause, but a subtle one, a sense that everything is aligned, everything is ready, everything is moving toward a single point. And in that stillness, there is often no indication of what is about to unfold, because from the outside, everything appears exactly as it should. The streets of Kirtland, Ohio remained calm. The routines continued. The world moved forward, unaware. But within this small, tightly connected group, something had shifted beyond belief, beyond structure, beyond even authority. It had moved into intention, not spoken, not declared, but present. And within that presence, the final stage was beginning. The plan was no longer forming. It was becoming real. As the quiet sense of readiness deepened within the group in Kirtland, Ohio, the shift from intention to clarity began to take hold, not through spoken plans or visible coordination, but through something far more subtle, shared understanding. Why now? Jeffrey Lundgren no longer needed to introduce new ideas or reinforce old ones. The framework he had built was complete. It existed not just in thought, but in behavior, in the way people moved, the way they responded, the way they no longer hesitated. And within that framework, the next step no longer needed explanation. It simply needed to be carried out. There is a particular kind of stillness that forms when a group reaches this point. Not the stillness of uncertainty, but the stillness of resolution. A quiet, almost unnoticeable shift where questions disappear, not because they have been answered, but because they are no longer asked. That stillness had settled fully. Interactions became more precise. Words were fewer, but carried more weight. Eye contact lingered slightly longer, as if confirming something that did not need to be spoken aloud. There was a shared rhythm now, a quiet synchronization that connected individuals without the need for discussion. And within that rhythm, roles had become clear, not assigned, but understood. Some members naturally positioned themselves closer to Lundgren, their presence reflecting a deeper alignment, a readiness that went beyond belief. Others supported in quieter ways, maintaining the structure, reinforcing the calm, ensuring that everything appeared as it always had, because outwardly, nothing had changed, and that, perhaps, was the most significant part. The normalcy remained intact, the calm tone persisted, the appearance of routine continued, but beneath it, everything had shifted. The family, still present within this environment, now existed almost as a fixed point within the group's internal understanding. Their role was no longer being interpreted. It had already been defined. They were part of what needed to be addressed, not as individuals, but as a function within the system. This shift in perception removed any remaining ambiguity. The group no longer saw the situation as complex or uncertain. It had been simplified, reduced to a matter of alignment and necessity. And within that simplicity, action becomes easier to accept, because complexity often invites hesitation. Simplicity removes it. Lundgren's presence during this time remained unchanged in tone, yet unmistakably central. He did not speak often, but when he did, his words carried a quiet finality. There was no room left for interpretation, no sense of ongoing exploration. Only conclusion. He spoke about readiness, about the importance of recognizing when understanding must transition into action, about the idea that there are moments when clarity demands response. These ideas were not new. But now, they felt immediate, because the group had reached a point where they were no longer preparing in abstract terms. They were prepared, and once preparation is complete, the only thing that remains is execution. This realization did not bring visible tension. It did not create urgency. Instead, it brought a kind of calm focus, a narrowing of attention that excluded everything except what was necessary. Conversations outside of this focus became less frequent. Distractions faded. The group moved with quiet purpose, each individual aligned with the shared understanding that had brought them to this point. There were no dramatic gestures and no visible signs of what was about to unfold, just the same calm presence, the same measured tone, the same quiet alignment. And within that alignment, a final layer of understanding settled, that what was about to happen was not a deviation from their beliefs, but a fulfillment of them. This belief was perhaps the most powerful element of all, because it transformed action into purpose. It removed doubt. It replaced hesitation with certainty, and within that certainty, individuals could move forward without conflict. The group had reached a point where their internal logic felt complete. Every step that had led them here had reinforced the next. Every idea had built upon the previous one, creating a structure that now stood fully formed. And within that structure, there was only one direction left to move forward. The quiet town of Kirtland, Ohio remained unchanged, its streets still, its routines uninterrupted. There was no indication that anything beyond ordinary life was taking place, because from the outside, nothing had changed. But inside this small, tightly connected group, everything had aligned. The plan, never spoken in full, never formally outlined, was now understood in its entirety, not as a list of steps, but as a shared destination. And within that destination, every individual knew their place, their role, their purpose. This is how moments of significant consequence often arrive, not with chaos, not with warning, but with quiet certainty, with calm alignment, with a stillness that suggests nothing is about to happen, even as everything is about to change. The final stage had been reached. There was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to prepare, nothing left to question, only the path forward. And within that path, the quiet calm that had defined everything until now remained intact, unbroken, unchanged, right up until the moment it would be. Chapter 9. The Night in Kirtland. There are moments in history that arrive not with noise, but with stillness. And on one particular night in Kirtland, Ohio, that stillness settled more deeply than usual. Nothing appeared different. The streets were quiet, as they had always been. Lights glowed softly in windows. The ordinary rhythm of life continued without interruption, untouched by what was about to unfold behind closed doors. Within the small circle that had formed around Jeffrey Lundgren, the calm remained. But it was no longer the calm of routine. It was the calm of conclusion. By this point, everything that needed to be understood had already been understood. The framework had been built. The roles had been accepted. The direction had been quietly agreed upon. There were no discussions that night, no debates, no last-minute questions. Because within the group, there was nothing left to resolve, only something to carry out. The atmosphere among them was composed, almost unnaturally so. Movements were deliberate. Voices, when used, were low and measured. There was no sense of urgency, no outward sign of tension, only focus. This kind of focus is difficult to recognize from the outside, because it does not look like intensity. It looks like control. Each individual moved with a quiet understanding of what was expected, not through instruction, not through command, but through the shared alignment that had been built over time. And at the center of it all, Lundgren remained steady, unchanged, His presence did not shift in tone or demeanor. He did not raise his voice. He did not display emotion in a way that would suggest the weight of the moment. Instead, he maintained the same calm authority that had guided the group from the beginning. And in that calmness, the others found certainty. Because if the one who understood remained composed, then what was unfolding must be part of that understanding. The family, whose presence had long been part of the group's internal narrative, was now central to the moment. Their role, as it had been defined within the system, had reached its conclusion, not through confrontation, not through visible conflict, but through the quiet logic that had been constructed over time. There is something deeply unsettling about moments like these, not because of what is seen, but because of what is absent. There was no chaos, no resistance that broke the calm, that no outward sign that anything extraordinary was taking place. Only a sequence of actions carried out within an environment that remained, on the surface, controlled. And that control made everything feel contained. The group moved together, not hurried, not disorganized. Each action followed the next with a kind of quiet precision. There was no need for direction in the moment, because direction had already been established long before. This is how systems operate when they reach a point of complete alignment. They no longer need guidance. They simply function. The night continued in this same measured way, step by step, moment by moment, without interruption, without hesitation, and throughout it all, the calm remained intact. It did not break. It did not falter. Because within the group, there was no perception that anything was out of place. Everything, in their understanding, was unfolding as it should. Outside, nothing had changed. Kirtland, Ohio remained quiet. The world beyond this small circle continued, unaware of what was taking place within it. There were no signs, no sounds that carried beyond the immediate space. The separation between inside and outside had never been more complete. Within that separation, the group's actions continued, steady, controlled, and guided by the structure that had brought them to this point. Time, in moments like these, can feel different, slower, more deliberate, as though each second carries more weight than usual. And within that stretched stillness, the significance of what is happening can be felt, even if it is not fully recognized, because recognition requires distance. And within the group, there was no distance, only involvement, only alignment, only the continuation of something that, to them, had been building for a long time. There were no sudden realizations, no shifts in perspective, no moments of hesitation that changed direction, because the direction had already been accepted, and once accepted, it did not change. The night moved forward, quietly, deliberately, with a calm that never broke, and within that calm, something irreversible was taking place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a stillness that made it all the more profound, because when something unfolds without resistance, it carries a different kind of weight, a quiet finality, a sense that what is happening is not being questioned, only completed. By the time the night began to draw toward its later hours, the stillness remained, uninterrupted, unchanged, but beneath it, everything had shifted. The group, though still composed, had crossed a threshold, one that could not be reversed, one that could not be undone. And yet, from the outside, there was nothing to seed no indication, no signal. Only the same quiet town, the same calm streets, the same sense of normalcy that had always defined Kirtland, Ohio. But within that normalcy, something had occurred, something that would not remain hidden forever, something that, in time, would begin to surface. The to be understood, the to be revealed. But for now, the night held its silence, and the stillness remained. As the final hours of that quiet night in Kirtland Ohio settled into stillness. What had taken place within the group did not end with action. It transitioned from execution into concealment. The same calm that had defined every step leading up to that moment remained present afterward. There was no sudden release of tension, no visible shift in demeanor. If anything, the atmosphere became even more controlled, more deliberate, as though every movement that followed carried an added layer of awareness. Within the circle around Jeffrey Lundgren, there was no sense of chaos, only continuation. This is often the least expected part of such moments, the way in which everything can appear to return to normal, even when something irreversible has occurred. The human mind often anticipates visible disruption, an emotional shift, a break in composure. But here, there was none. Instead, there was structure. The group moved with quiet coordination, as they had before. Their actions, though now directed toward a different purpose, carried the same precision, the same calm alignment that had guided them throughout. Because within their understanding, nothing had deviated from the path. Everything had unfolded as expected, and so, the next step felt just as natural as the one before it. The environment in which they operated remained contained, physically and psychologically. There was no outward expression of what had taken place, no acknowledgement beyond what was already understood internally. Silence, once again, became the defining element, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of completion. Within that silence, individuals returned to their roles, not in a formal sense, but in a way that reflected the structure that had been established long before. Some focused on maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Others ensured that the environment remained controlled, undisturbed, unchanged from the outside perspective, because the outside world had not changed, and it could not be allowed to. This separation between inside and outside had always existed within the group, but now it had deepened. It was no longer just a matter of perspective, that it was a matter of reality. Inside, everything had shifted. Outside, nothing had. And maintaining that distinction became essential. Lundgren's presence during this phase remained steady. He did not introduce new ideas or offer reflection on what had occurred. There was no need. Within the framework that had guided the group, the outcome was already understood. That it did not require explanation, only continuation. His calm demeanor reinforced the group's composure. If there had been any internal conflict, any moment of uncertainty, it did not surface. Because within this environment, there was no space for it. Everything had been resolved, and resolution, within this system, meant moving forward. The group's interactions in the hours that followed reflected this mindset. Conversations, when they occurred, remained controlled and minimal. There was no revisiting of what had taken place, no attempt to process or interpret, because interpretation had already happened, long before the night itself. This is what made the moments so contained, so complete. It was not an impulsive act. It was the conclusion of a process. And once that process reached its conclusion, there was nothing left to analyze, only to maintain. Time passed quietly. The night gave way to early morning. Though within the group, the passage of time seemed almost secondary. Their focus remained inward, directed toward preserving the structure that had carried them to this point. Every action was measured, every detail considered, not out of fear, but out of consistency, because consistency had always been central to their understanding, and now it guided everything that followed. Outside, Kirtland, Ohio began to stir with the first signs of a new day. Light returned gradually, touching the same streets, the same homes, the same quiet spaces that had remained unchanged throughout the night. Anyone observing from a distance, it was an ordinary morning. There were no visible signs of what had occurred, and no indication that anything had disrupted the calm. And yet, within that calm, something had shifted permanently back within the group. The transition from night to day did not bring reflection, it brought continuation. The same controlled atmosphere persisted. The same alignment remained intact, because within their understanding, there was no distinction between what had happened and what came next. It was all part of the same path, the same structure, the same purpose. There is a particular weight to moments like this, not because of visible intensity, but because of the absence of it. The lack of disruption, the continuation of calm, the quiet return to routine, all of it creates a sense of stillness that can feel almost unreal. But within that stillness, the reality remains. Something had occurred. Something that could not remain hidden forever, because while the group had maintained control within their environment, the world beyond it operated differently. It was not shaped by the same framework, not guided by the same interpretations, and eventually, that difference would begin to surface, but not yet. For now, the group remained within its structure, contained, aligned, and unchanged in its outward appearance. The night had ended, the actions had been completed, the silence had returned, and within that silence, everything continued as it had before, at least on the surface. Beneath it, the shift was absolute, irreversible, and waiting quietly for the moment when it would no longer remain unseen. Chapter 10: Silence, Secrecy, and Control. In the days that followed, the quiet town of Kirtland, Ohio continued as it always had, unchanged on the surface, steady in its rhythm, untouched by anything that might suggest disruption. Morning routines resumed. Streets remained calm. Life, in every visible way, moved forward. But within the circle surrounding Jeffrey Lundgren, something far more deliberate had taken hold. Silence. Not the natural silence of peace or rest, but a constructed silence. A silence that served a purpose, that preserved a boundary between what had happened and what could be known. This silence was not imposed through force. It was understood. There were no instructions given that said, "Do not speak." There was no need for that. The structure that had been built over time, through alignment, through shared belief, through unquestioned authority, had already created the conditions for silence to exist naturally. Because within that structure, speaking unnecessarily could disrupt clarity, and clarity had always been essential. So, without discussion, without agreement, silence settled over the group like a continuation of everything that had come before. Conversations returned, but only to what was expected. Daily matters, ordinary exchanges, nothing that touched the deeper reality of what had taken place. It was as if a boundary had been drawn, invisible, but absolute. Inside that boundary, the truth remained contained. Outside of it, nothing appeared different. This is how secrecy often forms, not through concealment alone, but through structure, through a shared understanding of what belongs within the system and what does not. And within this group, that understanding was complete. Members resumed their routines with the same composure that had defined the night before. There was no visible change in behavior, no outward sign that anything significant had occurred. If anything, their actions appeared even more controlled, more deliberate, because now, maintaining normalcy had become part of the system. Lundgren's role during this time reflected that same quiet control. He did not gather the group to reflect. He did not revisit the events that had taken place. There was no discussion of what had happened, no attempt to frame it or reinterpret it. There was no need. Within the framework he had created, everything had already been understood. And once something is fully understood within a system like this, It does not require further examination, that IT simply becomes part of the structure. This lack of discussion reinforced the silence. It removed any possibility of deviation, any opportunity for uncertainty to reemerge. Because to discuss something is to open it to interpretation, and interpretation, at this stage, was no longer necessary. Everything had been decided, everything had been completed, everything had been absorbed into the system. The group's interactions reflected this absorption. There was a quiet consistency in how they spoke, how they moved, how they engaged with one another. It was not rigid, but it was precise, measured, controlled. And within that control, there was no space for disruption. This is where silence becomes powerful, not because it hides something, but because it maintains something. It preserves the structure that has been built. It prevents external influence from entering. It keeps the system intact. Within the group, this preservation became instinctive. Individuals did not need reminders. They did not need reinforcement. The silence was self-sustaining, supported by the same alignment that had guided everything else. But beneath that silence, there was something else, not visible, not expressed, but present, awareness, not of wrongdoing, not in the way the outside world might define it, but of significance, of the fact that something had occurred that existed outside the ordinary flow of life. And that awareness, though contained, added weight to the silence, because it meant that the silence was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of shared experience, full of something that could not be spoken without breaking the structure. And so, it remained unspoken. Days passed in this way, quietly, steadily. With the same outward appearance of normalcy, the town of Kirtland, Ohio remained unchanged, unaware of the contained reality within this small group. There were no signs, no disruptions, no reasons for concern. Everything appeared as it always had, and that appearance was carefully maintained, because within the group, control had extended beyond belief, beyond action, and into perception itself. What was seen, what was said, what was allowed to exist within the visible world, all of it was now part of the system, and within that system, nothing existed without purpose. Not even silence. Silence served to protect, preserved, maintain the integrity of what had been built. And in doing so, it created a space where everything could continue as if nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, the reality remained. Unspoken, contained, and increasingly difficult to hold. Because while silence can preserve a system, it cannot stop time. It cannot prevent questions from arising beyond its boundaries. And eventually, no matter how controlled an environment may be, something from within it begins to surface. A detail, a pattern, a moment that does not fully align with the outside world's understanding. And when that happens, the boundary between silence and exposure begins to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but inevitably. For now, the silence held. The structure remained intact. The control was complete. But beyond the edges of that control, the first signs of change were already beginning to form, quietly, unnoticed, but moving closer. For a time, the silence held. Within the group centered around Jeffrey Lundgren, the structure remained intact, calm, controlled, and outwardly unchanged. Days passed in Kirtland, Ohio, just as they always had. Morning routines continued. Familiar faces moved through familiar places. Nothing appeared out of order, but silence, no matter how carefully maintained, has limits. It can contain. It can delay, but it cannot erase. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, small inconsistencies began to emerge, not within the group's internal understanding, but in how their reality intersected with the outside world. It did not begin with suspicion. It began with absence. The family, once part of a visible routine, was no longer present in the same way. Their absence was not immediately alarming. People move, routines change, lives shift. In a quiet town, such changes can pass without notice. But over time, absence becomes pattern, and patterns invite questions. At first, those questions were simple. Where had they gone? Had they left town? Were they traveling? There were no immediate answers. And in the absence of answers, curiosity begins to grow. Within the group, this shift was sensed before it was spoken, not through direct communication, but through subtle awareness. The outside world, though still distant from their internal structure, was beginning to move closer, not physically, but perceptually. And that change carried weight, because while the group had maintained control within their environment, the outside world operated differently. It was not guided by the same framework. It did not share the same assumptions. It noticed, it questioned, and eventually, it sought understanding. Lundgren's response to this shift remained consistent with everything that had come before: calm, composed, and without visible concern. He did not react outwardly to the growing awareness beyond the group. He did not alter the structure that had been established. Instead, he maintained it, because within his understanding, the system remained intact, and maintaining that system was the priority. The group followed this example. Their behavior did not change in any obvious way. They continued their routines, their interactions, their outward presence within the community. But beneath that normalcy, there was a heightened awareness, a recognition that the boundary between inside and outside was no longer as absolute as it had been. This awareness did not lead to panic. It led to reinforcement. The group became even more aligned in their behavior, even more consistent in their interactions. The silence that had defined their internal environment extended outward, not as withdrawal, but as careful communication. Words were chosen with precision. Details were controlled. Nothing unnecessary was shared. This kind of control can be effective for a time, but it also creates pressure, because maintaining a consistent external narrative requires constant attention. It demands alignment not just in belief, but in expression, and over time, that alignment becomes more difficult to sustain. Small inconsistencies can begin to appear at a detail that does not fully match, a response that raises further questions, a moment where the structure shows a slight fracture. These inconsistencies are rarely dramatic. They are subtle, but they are enough, because once questions begin, they do not easily stop. Outside the group, curiosity continued to grow. The absence of the family was no longer just a passing observation. It had become something that required explanation. And when explanations are not readily available, attention increases. People begin to look more closely, notice more, connect details that might have previously seemed unrelated. Within Kirtland, Ohio, this process unfolded quietly. There were no immediate conclusions, no sudden shifts in understanding. But there was a growing sense that something did not fully align with expectation. And that sense, once present, does not fade easily. Within the group, the pressure of this growing awareness remained contained, but it was present. Not expressed openly, not discussed, but felt at a subtle tension beneath the surface of their controlled environment. Because while the internal structure remained stable, the external world was becoming less predictable, and unpredictability introduces uncertainty. Even in the most tightly controlled systems, Lundgren's influence during this time remained steady, reinforcing the same principles that had guided the group from the beginning: alignment, clarity, consistency. He did not acknowledge the growing attention directly, but his emphasis on maintaining structure carried an added weight. Because now, Maintaining structure was not just about internal alignment, that it was about preserving the boundary between what was known and what could be discovered. The group responded accordingly. Their behavior remained composed. Their interactions remained measured. But the effort required to maintain that composure had increased, and with increased effort comes increased strain, not visible, not disruptive, but present. There were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, where that strain surfaced. A pause that lasted slightly too long. A response that required more thought than before. A glance exchanged between individuals that carried unspoken awareness. These moments passed quickly, but they existed, and over time, they accumulated. Outside, the quiet rhythm of Kirtland, Ohio continued, but now, it carried an undercurrent of attention. Nothing had been confirmed. Nothing had been revealed, but something had begun. A process, a movement from absence to question to awareness. And once awareness begins, it rarely stops. Within the group, the silence still held. The structure remained intact. The control was still present. But beyond the edges of that control, something was building. Something that could not be contained indefinitely. Because while silence can delay discovery, it cannot prevent it. The boundary that had once felt absolute was beginning to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. And with each passing day, the distance between what was hidden and what would eventually be known grew smaller. The silence remained, but it was no longer untouched. That it had begun to crack. Chapter 11. The Unraveling. It rarely begins with certainty. Not with conclusions, not with clarity, but with a question that refuses to settle. And in Kirtland, Ohio, that question had begun to take shape. Quietly at first, carried through conversations, observations, and the growing awareness that something no longer fit within the expected rhythm of life. The absence that had once been easy to overlook was no longer passing unnoticed. That it had become persistent. People began to ask more directly. Now, not out of suspicion, but out of concern. Familiar routines had been interrupted, and in a town where patterns were often steady and predictable, that disruption carried weight. Where had the family gone? Why had no one heard from them? Why did the answers, when they came, feel incomplete? These were not accusations, they were questions. But questions, once repeated often enough, begin to shift in tone. They become more focused, more deliberate, and eventually, they begin to seek answers beyond conversation. This is how unraveling begins, not with confrontation, but with attention. Within the circle surrounding Jeffrey Lundgren, this shift was felt long before it was visible. The group, so carefully aligned and controlled, began to experience something unfamiliar. External pressure, not direct, not immediate, but present. A quiet movement from outside that did not operate within their system, did not follow their logic, did not accept their silence as sufficient. And that difference created tension, because while the group had maintained control internally, the outside world could not be shaped in the same way. It observed, it questioned, and eventually, it acted. Initial inquiries were simple. Conversations with neighbors, casual attempts to understand the absence, small efforts to piece together a picture that made sense. At this stage, there was no assumption of wrongdoing, only curiosity. But curiosity, when met with uncertainty, does not fade. It grows. Within the group, responses remained controlled. The same careful language, the same measured tone, the same consistency that had defined their silence continued. Nothing was offered beyond what was necessary. Nothing that would disrupt the structure. And for a time, that control held. But as questions persisted, as attention increased, the limitations of that control began to appear. Because the outside world does not operate on alignment, that IT operates on verification, and verification requires more than consistency. That IT requires evidence. As the days passed, the questions began to move beyond informal conversation. What had started as concern became something more structured. People began to seek answers through official channels, through processes designed to move beyond assumption and into understanding. This shift marked a turning point, because once a situation enters that space, where questions are formalized, where answers are sought through structured inquiry, the dynamics change, the pace quickens, the focus sharpens, and the margin for uncertainty narrows. Within Kirtland, Ohio, this change unfolded without noise, without spectacle. There were no sudden disruptions, no visible escalation. But beneath the surface, the process had begun. An effort to understand. To locate. To explain. And within that effort, details began to matter. Timelines, interactions, movements, things that might have once seemed insignificant were now being viewed with greater attention. Not because they were immediately meaningful, but because they might become so. Within the group, this shift created a subtle but undeniable change in atmosphere. The control remained, but it was now accompanied by awareness that the outside world was no longer distant. That IT was approaching, not physically, but through process, through inquiry, through a methodical attempt to understand what had happened. Lundgren's presence during this time remained outwardly unchanged. He did not display concern. He did not alter the structure of the group. His tone, his demeanor, his approach, all remained consistent with what had come before. But within that consistency, there was now a different context, because the system he had built was no longer isolated. IT was being observed, and observation, when applied from outside the system, introduces something that cannot be controlled. Perspective. A perspective that does not rely on shared belief. A perspective that does not accept internal logic as explanation. A perspective that seeks evidence. And once evidence begins to be sought, the structure of secrecy begins to weaken. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. Within the group, the response to this shift remained focused on maintaining alignment. Behavior continued to reflect control. Communication remained measured. The silence, though now under pressure, did not break, but the effort required to maintain it increased, because now every interaction carried potential significance. Every detail mattered, and in that environment, even small inconsistencies could carry weight. Outside, the process of understanding continued to develop. Questions led to more questions. Observations led to further inquiry, and slowly, the outline of something larger began to take shape, not fully visible, not yet understood, but present. And as that outline formed, the distance between what had been hidden and what was beginning to surface grew smaller. Within Kirtland, Ohio, the calm remained, but it was no longer untouched. Beneath it, something had begun to move. A quiet unraveling, not driven by emotion, but by process. By the steady, deliberate effort to understand what did not yet make sense. And once that process begins, it does not stop easily, because each answer leads to another question. Each detail leads to another observation, and each step brings the truth a little closer to the surface. Within the group, the silence still held, but beyond it, something was shifting, something that could not be contained. Indefinitely, the unraveling had begun. As the process of inquiry deepened in Kirtland, Ohio, what had once been a quiet search for answers began to move towards something more defined. Clarity, not immediate, not complete, but forming. The questions that had circulated in fragments were now being gathered, examined, and placed into a broader context. Patterns began to emerge, not obvious at first, but enough to suggest that the situation was more complex than it had initially appeared. And once complexity is recognized, attention sharpens. The effort to understand what had happened moved beyond general curiosity and into structured investigation. Details that had once seemed disconnected were now being compared, aligned, and evaluated together. Timelines began to take shape. Movements were noted. Conversations were revisited, not for their surface meaning, but for what they might reveal when placed alongside everything else. This is how truth begins to surface, not all at once, but in pieces, and as those pieces begin to fit together, the picture they form becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Within the circles surrounding Jeffrey Lundgren, this shift could no longer be experienced as distant. The external process, the steady, methodical effort to understand, had moved closer. It was no longer abstract. It was present. And with that presence came a change in the atmosphere. The control remained. The silence persisted. But beneath it, something else had begun to take hold. Pressure, not expressed, not acknowledged, but felt. Because while the internal structure of the group had been built on certainty, the external world was now applying a different kind of structure, one based on verification, on evidence, on the need for answers that extended beyond belief. And those two structures could not remain separate indefinitely. As inquiries continued, more attention turned toward the group itself, not with immediate accusation, but with increasing interest. Their proximity to the situation, their connection to those who were no longer present, these factors began to draw focus. Questions became more specific, more directed, and with that shift, the margin for ambiguity began to narrow. Within the group, responses remained consistent. The same careful language, the same controlled tone, the same adherence to the established structure. But now, each response carried more weight, because it was no longer part of casual conversation. It was part of something more formal, something that required clarity, something that could not be sustained by silence alone. There were moments, subtle, almost imperceptible, where the strain of maintaining that consistency began to show. A pause that lingered slightly longer, a detail that required clarification, a response that did not fully align with another. Individually, these moments were small, but together they began to form a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, are difficult to dismiss. The process continued, steadily, methodically, each new piece of information adding to the overall understanding, each connection bringing the situation into sharper focus. Within Kirtland, Ohio, the quiet calm remained, but now it carried an undercurrent of awareness. People spoke more carefully, listened more closely, observed more attentively, because something was happening, something that had not yet been fully revealed, but was moving in that direction. Within the group, the internal structure that had once felt complete now faced something it had not been designed to handle. External examination. A perspective that did not accept internal logic as explanation. A process that required evidence, not alignment. And within that process, the boundaries that had once contained everything began to weaken, not suddenly, but inevitably, because no system, no matter how controlled, can fully isolate itself from the reality beyond it. And as that reality pressed closer, the truth, once contained within silence, began to move outward, not through confession, not through admission, but through discovery, through the gradual uncovering of details that, when brought together, formed a picture that could no longer be ignored. Within the group, this shift marked a turning point. The silence, though still present, no longer held the same certainty, because certainty requires stability, and stability had begun to change. The structure that had once guided everything now faced something it could not fully control, and within that moment, the balance shifted. from containment to exposure. The outside world, now moving with greater clarity, continued its process. Each step deliberate, each action measured, each decision guided by the information that had been gathered. And with each step, the truth came closer to the surface, closer to being understood, closer to being seen. Within Kirtland, Ohio, the quiet was no longer untouched. It carried weight now, a sense that something significant was unfolding, even if it had not yet been fully revealed. And within that unfolding, the group's control, once absolute, began to give way. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough for the process to continue. Enough for the truth to move forward. And once the truth begins to move forward, it does not stop. It cannot be contained again. It cannot be returned to silence. It continues, step by step, until it reaches the surface, until it becomes known, until it replaces uncertainty with understanding. The unraveling was no longer just beginning. It was underway, and with it, the reality that had once existed only within the boundaries of a closed system was moving outward into a world that would interpret it differently, a world where silence does not hold, a world where answers are required, and where, eventually, everything is revealed. Chapter 12. Echoes of Faith and Fear. When the truth finally reaches the surface, it rarely arrives all at once. It unfolds, slowly, piece by piece. And in Kirtland, Ohio, what had once been quiet uncertainty gave way to something far more defined, an understanding that extended beyond questions and into reality. The disappearance that had once been a matter of concern was now recognized as something far more significant. What had been hidden within silence was no longer contained. The structure that had once held everything together had given way to a process that moved forward with clarity, guided not by belief, but by evidence. And as that process continued, the story began to take shape. Not as it had been understood within the group surrounding Jeffrey Lundgren, but as it existed within the broader world, a world that did not share the same framework, the same interpretations, the same certainty. A world that sought explanation, accountability, understanding. The shift from internal logic to external reality was profound. Within the group, everything had followed a structure that felt consistent, even necessary. But outside of that structure, those same actions were seen differently, through a lens that emphasized consequence rather than intention. And within that lens, the weight of what had occurred became clear. For the wider community, the realization came with a sense of disbelief. The quiet nature of Kirtland, its steady rhythm, its absence of disruption, none of it had suggested that something of this magnitude could unfold within its boundaries. There is a particular kind of shock that accompanies such moments, not because they are loud or chaotic, but because they are unexpected, because they emerge from places that seem ordinary. And in that ordinariness, they feel even more difficult to comprehend. How could something like this happen here? How could it develop without being seen? How could it remain hidden for so long? These questions echoed throughout the community, not as accusations, but as attempts to understand make sense of something that did not easily fit within the familiar patterns of everyday life. As more details became known, the narrative that had once existed only within the group was replaced by a broader understanding, one that connected actions to consequences, that placed events within a context that extended beyond belief. And within that context, the role of Lundgren became central to no longer as a guide within a closed system, but as a figure within a wider story, one that would be examined, discussed, and remembered. There is a shift that occurs when a private reality becomes public. It changes how events are understood, how they are interpreted, how they are remembered. Within the group, actions had been seen as part of a structure. Outside of it, they were seen as something else entirely, and that difference in perspective shaped everything that followed. The process of accountability began, not abruptly, but with the same steady progression that had defined the uncovering of truth. It moved through established systems, guided by procedures designed to bring clarity and resolution. Within this process, details were examined carefully, not assumed, not interpreted through belief, but evaluated based on evidence, and through that evaluation, the full scope of what had occurred began to emerge. For those who had been part of the group, this transition marked a profound shift. The structure that had once defined their understanding no longer held the same authority. The framework that had guided their actions was now being examined from the outside. And within that examination, it was no longer self-contained that it was part of something larger, something that extended beyond their control. This shift can be disorienting, because it replaces certainty with questioning. It introduces perspectives that had previously been excluded. It challenges the very foundation upon which previous understanding had been built. Within the group, individuals faced this transition in different ways. Some maintained the same alignment, holding on to the structure that had guided them. Others began to experience the weight of external perspective, the realization that the world beyond their system interpreted events differently. And in that realization, new questions began to form, questions that had not existed before, questions that did not have immediate answers. The town of Kirtland, Ohio, meanwhile, continued to process the unfolding reality. Conversations shifted from curiosity to understanding, from uncertainty to recognition. The quiet calm that had once defined the town was still present, but now it carried a memory of something that had happened within its boundaries, something that would not be forgotten. There is a lasting impact to events like these, not just in the immediate aftermath, but in the way they linger, in the way they shape perception, influence understanding, and remain part of the collective memory of a place. Kirtland would continue, its routines would return, its quiet streets would remain, but the awareness of what had occurred would stay with it, subtle, but present. A reminder of how something complex can develop beneath the surface of even the most ordinary environments. As the process of understanding continued, the story of Jeffrey Lundgren and the events that had unfolded became part of a broader narrative, one that would be examined not just for what happened, but for how it happened, for the progression, the structure, the way belief evolved into action. And within that examination, the deeper questions remained, not just about the events themselves, but about the conditions that allowed them to unfold, the dynamics that shaped them, the quiet steps that led from understanding to certainty to consequence. Because in stories like this, the most important questions are often not about the moment itself, but about everything that led up to it and everything that remains afterward. In the years that followed, the events that unfolded in Kirtland, Ohio did not simply fade into the past. They settled, not loudly, not constantly, but in a quiet, lasting way, woven into memory, into reflection, into the way people would come to understand how something so complex could emerge from something that once seemed so ordinary. The story of Jeffrey Lundgren became more than a sequence of events. It became a point of study, at a moment examined not only for what happened, but for how it unfolded, step by step, layer by layer, through a progression that, in hindsight, revealed itself with a kind of quiet clarity. Its center was not chaos, but structure, not sudden change, but gradual alignment. And perhaps that is what made it so difficult to recognize in real time, because nothing appeared out of place until everything had already shifted. For those who looked back on it, the questions remained, not just about the actions themselves, but about the conditions that allowed those actions take shape. How belief evolved into certainty. How certainty narrowed perspective. How a group, over time, came to rely on a single interpretation of reality. These were not questions with simple answers. They required reflection, consideration, and understanding that human behavior, especially within tightly connected systems, does not always follow obvious patterns. There is a natural tendency to search for a single explanation, a moment where everything changed, a clear turning point that can be identified and understood. But in this case, as in many others, no such moment existed. Instead, there was a progression, a series of small shifts that, on their own, seemed insignificant, but together created something far more substantial. This is what gives such stories their lasting impact. Not just the outcome, but the process. Because within that process are insights about influence, about perception, about the ways in which individuals and groups can move, slowly and quietly, toward conclusions that once seemed unthinkable. In Kirtland, life continued. The same streets, the same homes, the same quiet rhythm that had always defined the town. But beneath that rhythm, there remained an awareness, not constant, not overwhelming, but present. A recognition that something had happened there, something that had revealed how even the most ordinary environments can hold complexities that are not immediately visible. For the broader world, the story became part of a larger conversation. It was discussed, analyzed, and revisited, not only for its details, but for what it represented: the dynamics of belief, the influence of authority, the ways in which groups can form, evolve, and, under certain conditions, move in directions that are difficult to anticipate. These discussions extended beyond the specific events themselves. They became part of a broader effort to understand how similar situations might develop elsewhere, how early signs might be recognized, how structures might be understood before they reach a point of consequence. But even with that understanding, one truth remained: that such processes are rarely obvious as they unfold. They are quiet, gradual, often indistinguishable from ordinary behavior until they reach a point where their impact becomes clear. And by then, the path that led there has already been established. Within the group itself, the long-term effects were complex. The structure that had once provided certainty no longer existed in the same way. The framework that had guided thought and action had been replaced by external understanding, by a reality that did not align with what had once felt so clear. This kind of shift can leave lasting impressions, because it challenges not only what happened, but how it was understood. It introduces questions that extend beyond the moment. Questions about trust, about perception, about the nature of belief itself. And those questions do not always have immediate answers. They remain, quietly, over time. Part of a process of reflection that continues long after the events themselves have passed. For those observing from the outside, the story remains a reminder, not of fear, but of awareness of the importance of understanding how influence works, how ideas can evolve, how systems can form in ways that feel stable, even as they move towards something else. It is not a story about a single moment. It is a story about progression, about the accumulation of small changes that, together, create something significant. And in that progression, there is a lesson, not simple, not direct, but present. That understanding requires attention. That awareness often begins with small observations. That the most important shifts are not always the ones that announce themselves. They are the ones that unfold quietly, just beneath the surface. As the years pass, the memory of what happened in Kirtland, Ohio remains part of its history, not in a way that defines it, but in a way that informs it. A reminder of Complexity of the layers that exist within even the most familiar places of how belief, when shaped within a closed system, can take on a direction that feels certain from within, but appears very different from the outside. And in that contrast, the full weight of the story can be understood, not just as an event, but as a reflection of how human understanding can evolve, how influence can grow, and how, in quiet ways, paths can form that lead far beyond where they began. The stillness has returned to Kirtland. The calm remains, but beneath it, there is memory. And within that memory, the echoes of faith and fear continue. Not loudly, not urgently, but quietly. They as a reminder, they as a question, that as something to be understood long after the story itself has reached its end.